My name is Elise Mitchell. I am 29 years old. Grandpa Henry died on a Thursday. By Friday morning, my name was erased from his estate. My mother stood in his living room handing out packing tape and told me he had changed the documents himself. She called me sweetheart while she said it. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just stared at the faded rectangular outline on the floral wallpaper where Grandpa's antique barometer had hung for 4 decades. My older brother had already taken it off the wall. I turned around and walked out into the freezing prairie wind without a single word. I let them think they won. I let them count the money they thought they had stolen. Because quiet people do not declare war. They just hand you the shovel and watch you dig. Before I take you back to that freezing Friday and show you how I tore their perfect plan down to the studs, take a second to like this video, subscribe to QT Told Stories, and drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. I read every single one. Now let me take you to the start. North Dakota in February does not forgive. The wind comes off the Canadian border and cuts straight through the plains. The phone call from my mother came at 8 o'clock on Thursday night. I was grading earth science exams at my kitchen table. Susan Mitchell did not say my grandfather had passed away. She said Henry expired. She spoke with the brisk, flat tone of a woman canceling a dental appointment. She told me to drive out to the farm the next morning to help sort his things. Grandpa Henry owned 2,000 acres of wheat fields, sitting right on top of the Bakken Formation. He worked that soil until his knuckles swelled and his spine curved. He taught me how to test the pH levels of the dirt before I was old enough to drive. He used to tell me that the earth never lies to you, but people will look you in the eye and sell you the sky. I spent my Friday morning drive thinking about his calloused hands. My old sedan heater rattled the entire hour it took to reach his property. I expected to find a house in mourning. I expected to find my family sitting around his oak dining table, sharing memories and drinking bad coffee. I parked next to my brother Carter's leased European sports car. Carter is 34. He refers to himself as a serial entrepreneur. In reality, he is a man who relies on family bailouts to fund a string of failed apps and ghost kitchen concepts. I walked up the porch steps and opened the heavy wooden door. The house did not smell like grief. It smelled like cardboard and Sharpie markers. My father, David, was meticulously wrapping Grandpa's silver flatware in newspaper. My father has spent 30 years avoiding conflict by simply agreeing with whatever my mother dictates. He did not look up when I walked in. He just kept wrapping spoons. Carter was standing by the fireplace drinking Grandpa's good bourbon from a crystal glass at 10 in the morning. My mother was standing in the center of the room with a clipboard. She looked at me and sighed. Elise, glad you made it. Grab some boxes from the mudroom. We have a lot of ground to cover before the real estate agent gets here. I stopped in the doorway. He died yesterday, Mom. She waved her pen in the air. The market waits for no one, Elise. Henry was a practical man. He would want us to be efficient. Besides, Carter has investors waiting on his new logistics startup. We need to liquidate. Liquidate. She used the word like she was talking about a bankrupt retail store, not the home where my father grew up. I took off my coat and draped it over a kitchen chair. I asked her what she meant about Carter's investors. Carter swirled the bourbon in his glass and smirked. The golden child never missed a chance to explain his own brilliance. I need seed capital, Elise. Mom and Dad agreed that the farm sale is the perfect bridge loan. I looked at my father. He kept his eyes glued to the silverware. I looked back at my mother. I reminded her that Grandpa's will divided the estate evenly, half to my parents, quarter to Carter, quarter to me. That was the arrangement he made 5 years ago. Susan clicked her pen. Her posture straightened. She put on the voice she used when she wanted me to feel unreasonable and small. Well, Henry amended things. Last month. He realized Carter is the only one building a legacy. You have your teaching job. You are stable. Carter is creating wealth. Henry signed over the entire estate to Carter. You are not in the documents anymore, sweetheart. I did not react. I teach high school freshmen. I know how to read a room, and I know when a lie is being rehearsed. Susan's eye contact was too steady. Carter's smirk was too tight. My father dropping a silver spoon onto the hardwood floor was too loud. I looked past my mother's shoulder. On the far wall between two windows looking out over the frozen prairie, there was a patch of wallpaper that was brighter than the rest, a perfect, unfaded rectangle. Grandpa's brass barometer had hung on that exact spot since 1984. He tapped the glass every single morning to check the atmospheric pressure. It was his prized possession. The wall was empty. I glanced at the hallway. A cardboard box sat near Carter's expensive leather boots. The brass edge of the barometer was poking out of the top flap. My grandfather had been dead for less than 24 hours, and my brother was already looting the walls. They were not grieving. They were scavenging. I turned my attention back to my mother. I kept my voice soft and level. I asked to see the amendment. Susan's smile slipped for a fraction of a second. She told me it was with the estate files and that I did not need to worry my head over legal paperwork. I did not move. I just stood in the center of the living room, letting the silence stretch out, letting the cold draft from the window settle over us. I told her I would not touch a single box until I saw the paper with Grandpa's signature. David stopped wrapping the silver. Carter stopped drinking his bourbon. Susan stared at me, calculating the path of least resistance. She walked over to her designer tote bag, unzipped a leather folder, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She handed it to me like it was a parking ticket. I took the paper. I read the text. It was a standard relinquishment of rights, transferring all my inherited assets to Carter Mitchell. But the words did not matter. What mattered was the ink at the bottom of the page, the ink that was about to turn a quiet family dispute into a federal crime. The paper felt unnaturally light in my hands. It was a standard, cheap 20-pound printer stock that crinkled sharply between my thumb and forefinger. The toner ink across the top of the page was crisp and dark, proving this document had not been sitting inside a dusty safety deposit box for years. It had been generated recently. The bold heading read, "Waiver of Beneficiary Rights." The legal jargon underneath was a dense block of text outlining the immediate transfer of all my inherited assets, claims, and future interests directly into the sole possession of Carter Mitchell. It read like a generic template downloaded from a discount legal website. But the words themselves were irrelevant. The true story of that document lived at the very bottom of the page, resting on two dotted lines. I looked at the first signature. Henry J. Mitchell. My grandfather spent 40 years gripping the heavy steering wheels of combine harvesters, wrenching rusted iron bolts on broken tractors in sub-zero temperatures, and hauling grain sacks until his spine curved. By the time he turned 70, his hands were living monuments to hard labor. His knuckles were swollen and thick, resembling knots in old oak wood. During his final 2 years, severe rheumatoid arthritis settled into his joints with brutal, unrelenting permanence. I visited him every Sunday afternoon. I would sit across from him at the kitchen table and watch him struggle to hold a coffee mug. Just 3 months ago, he tried to write a check for my birthday. I watched him grip the pen so tight, his fingernails turned stark white. The plastic pen trembled violently against the paper. The resulting signature was a jagged, fractured landscape of ink. It tore into the paper check, starting and stopping abruptly as he fought through the physical pain of forming every single letter. The signature resting on the page in my hands contained no pain. The dark blue ink flowed across the dotted line with elegant, unbroken grace. It was a fluid, confident cursive script executed with the seamless sweep of a healthy, youthful wrist. There was no hesitation in the ink, no tremors translated into the loops of the letters. It was simply too smooth. It was too fast. I stared at the distinctive, arrogant slant of the capital M. I had seen that exact, dramatic slant on countless I-O-Us and half-baked business proposals over the past decade. It was Carter's handwriting. My brother had not even tried to disguise his own penmanship. He was so deeply insulated by our mother's lifelong suffocating protection that he genuinely believed he was untouchable. He believed he could just write our grandfather's name and reality would bend to accommodate him. Then my eyes dropped down 2 inches. There, on the witness line, sat my own name, Elise Renee Mitchell. The air in the living room grew thin, but I controlled my breathing. I did not let my chest heave. I am an earth science teacher. My profession requires me to grade hundreds of handwritten lab reports and essays every single week. I spot plagiarized homework and forged parent signatures on detention slips before the morning bell even rings. I know how to analyze the pressure flow and rhythm of a pen stroke. I stared at the shape of my own name on the fraudulent paper. When you sign your name a dozen times a day on hall passes and permission forms, your signature devolves into an efficient, chaotic blur. You do not think about the individual letters. You rely entirely on quick muscle memory. The signature on this amendment was utterly devoid of muscle memory. It was drawn, not written. The pressure of the pen tip was perfectly uniform from the start of the first E to the tail of the final L. This indicated a slow, deliberate tracing process rather than a natural, fluid signature. I looked much closer at the peculiar looping flourish on the letter R. It was an ornate little detail I used only once a year, specifically when signing formal greeting cards. I thought back to last May, Mother's Day. I had purchased a card with a watercolor painting of a prairie bird on the front. I had signed it for Susan using that exact, careful flourish. My mother had kept that card displayed on the fireplace mantel for months. Now the meticulous tracing of that exact signature stared back at me from a fraudulent legal document. The stakes in the room shifted instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. This was no longer a petty family squabble over an antique barometer and some silver spoons. This was not a simple case of a favored son manipulating an elderly parent for a larger slice of the financial pie. Susan David and Carter had crossed a very rigid, very dangerous line. By fabricating this amendment and forging my signature alongside my grandfather's, they had committed felony fraud. If they submitted this fabricated piece of paper to the county probate court, they would be committing perjury under oath. The penalty for defrauding a federal estate and committing perjury in the state of North Dakota is not a gentle slap on the wrist. It is a mandatory prison sentence. I lowered the paper slightly and observed my family. The silence in the room was dense and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I evaluated the 3 of them not as my relatives, but as accomplices in a crime. Carter took another long sip of his bourbon. He leaned against the stone fireplace, exuding an aura of unearned triumph. He truly believed he had outsmarted the legal system. His boundless arrogance was his defining characteristic, the very reason his tech startups and business ventures always imploded. He never accounted for the small details. He only ever saw the finish line. Susan stood a few feet away, her posture rigid and perfect. A thin, expectant smile played on her lips. She was waiting for the detonation. She wanted me to raise my voice. She wanted me to cry, to throw the paper across the room, to accuse them of theft. Her entire lifelong strategy relied on baiting me into losing my temper so she could dismiss me as hysterical, bitter, and irrational to the rest of our extended family. David, meanwhile, could not bring himself to look at me. His silence was the loudest sound in the house. He was an accomplice by cowardice. He kept his head bowed, rubbing a polishing cloth over a silver spoon with frantic, repetitive motions. His face was pale. He knew the terrifying gravity of the crime they had just committed, but his lifelong fear of Susan heavily outweighed his decaying moral compass. I realized in that exact moment that confronting them would be a massive tactical error. Arguing with a thief only teaches them how to hide the stolen goods better. I needed them to feel victorious. I needed them to feel so incredibly secure in their crime that they would proudly walk into a courthouse and file that piece of paper onto the public record, cementing their own undeniable guilt. I folded the photocopy neatly in half, pressing the crease down flat with my thumb. I walked over to the dining table where my father was working. I placed the folded paper gently on top of a stack of old newspaper. I turned and looked Susan directly in the eyes. I kept my face neutral, draining every ounce of emotion, anger, and betrayal from my expression until I was looking at her like a stranger. "Okay," I said. Just one word, 2 syllables, spoken softly. The psychological effect was instantaneous. Susan's thin, victorious smile faltered, quickly replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. Carter lowered his crystal glass, his smirk vanishing into a frown. They had rehearsed their defenses for days. They had prepared for a screaming match. They had weaponized their counter-arguments. They had no idea what to do with a quiet, polite surrender. The total lack of friction threw them entirely off balance. I did not wait for them to recover their footing. I turned my back, walked into the kitchen, picked up my winter coat from the wooden chair, and headed straight for the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me with a solid, final thud. The North Dakota air hit me the moment I stepped off the porch. The wind howling across the frozen wheat fields was brutal, biting straight through my sweater, but I barely felt the cold. My mind was racing, calculating the exact trajectory of the trap they had just set for themselves. I walked to my old sedan, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. I unlocked the door, slid into the freezing driver's seat, and gripped the steering wheel. I let out a long, slow breath, watching it turn to white mist in the freezing cabin. Have you ever stood in a room and watched someone smile at you while they picked your pocket? Have you ever felt the urge to scream, but realized that absolute silence is a much sharper weapon? If you have ever had to pretend you were defeated just to let your enemy grow sloppy and arrogant, drop a comment below and tell me how long you waited to spring the trap. I put the keys in the ignition and turned the engine over. The old heater rattled to life, blowing cold air against my numb fingers. The dirt road leading away from the farm was a sheet of packed ice. I drove slowly, watching the sprawling acreage of the Mitchell farm shrink in my rearview mirror. My family thought they had cleverly rewritten the rules of my grandfather's estate. They did not realize that Grandpa Henry had anticipated their blinding greed long before his hand stopped working. He had warned me this exact day would come. I was not driving back to my apartment. I was driving straight into town to visit the man who was going to help me tear their lives apart. 7 days. That is exactly how long it took my brother to turn our grandfather's death into a down payment. The following Friday, my phone buzzed with a social media notification. Carter had posted a photo to his public feed. He was leaning against the polished chrome grille of a jet black, heavy-duty luxury pickup truck. The sticker price on that specific model hovered right around $90,000. It featured oversized off-road tires, a pristine leather interior, and an upgraded suspension system designed to conquer rugged mountain passes. Carter lived in a sleek downtown loft and ran his failing businesses from expensive coffee shops. That truck would never see a single ounce of actual North Dakota mud. The caption underneath his photo read, "Big moves ahead. Grateful for the legacy. Building the future." I knew exactly how he acquired the keys to that vehicle. A man with a documented history of bankrupt ghost kitchens and maxed-out credit cards does not walk into a premium dealership and secure a $90,000 asset on his own merit. He had taken that cheap forged amendment into a local bank. He presented the fraudulent paperwork to a loan officer as guaranteed impending collateral. He leveraged a 2,000-acre wheat farm he did not own to secure a high-interest bridge loan. The bank, seeing a vast expanse of prime Bakken Formation real estate backing the signature, approved the credit line. He was spending a fortune he had stolen on paper just 1 week prior. The next evening, Susan summoned me to my childhood home for what she phrased as a family healing dinner. I drove my 12-year-old sedan to the house, intentionally parking on the street to leave the wide concrete driveway open for Carter's gleaming new monument to financial illiteracy. The contrast between my rusted wheel wells and his spotless chrome bumper was almost poetic. I walked up the front path, feeling the familiar sharp bite of the winter wind against my cheeks, and pushed the front door open. Inside, the house smelled of roasted garlic, fresh rosemary, and expensive Cabernet. There were no black mourning clothes. There were no hushed tones or tear-stained tissues. My father was uncorking a second bottle of imported wine, while my mother arranged artisan cheeses on a slate board. The dining room looked like a corporate celebration. It sounded like a boardroom meeting anticipating a lucrative merger. I took my seat at the far end of the long oak table. I kept my hands folded in my lap and my expression neutral, maintaining the quiet surrender I had established the week before. For the next hour, I sat in silence and listened to them carve up the map of my grandfather's life. Susan steered the conversation with clinical precision. She proudly announced they were already in advanced talks with a major commercial developer based out of Fargo. The developer wanted to purchase 1,500 acres of the prime agricultural land to pave over for a regional logistics and distribution center. David nodded along, swirling his dark wine, calculating the surface value of the topsoil out loud. They spoke about the rolling wheat fields and the deep prairie earth as if they were just numbers on a balance sheet. They did not know the dirt. I did. Sitting there listening to the sharp clink of silver forks against porcelain plates, my mind drifted away from the dining room. I went back to a freezing November dawn 15 years ago. I was 14 years old. Grandpa Henry had shaken me awake long before the sun crested the horizon. We drove his battered, heaterless work truck out to the very edge of the northern acreage. The ground was frozen solid, crunching under our heavy insulated boots like shattered glass. He handed me a cold metal core sampler and a small plastic testing kit. He taught me how to extract a plug of the frozen earth, mix it with distilled water, and carefully add 3 drops of chemical indicator solution. We huddled together in the biting cold, shielding the plastic tube from the wind, watching the liquid slowly change color from a pale acidic yellow to a deep, healthy green. He rested his thick, dirt-stained hand on my shoulder, his breath plumed in the freezing air, framing his weathered face. He told me that farming was not about forcing the ground to do what you want. It was about listening to what the ground could sustain. He pointed a finger at the vast, empty horizon. "The earth never lies to you, Elise," he said. "It gives you the exact answer you ask for. But people sure do. People will look you dead in the eye and swear the sky is green just to steal your shoes. Pay attention to the ground. Let other people do the talking." I pulled myself back to the present moment. Carter was doing exactly what Grandpa had warned me about. He was doing all the talking. He leaned back in his dining chair, unbuttoned the top of his expensive tailored shirt, and pointed his half-empty wineglass in my direction. "So, Elise," he said, his voice dripping with loud, manufactured confidence, "how are the teenagers treating you down at the high school? Still teaching them about rocks and dirt?" "Earth science," I corrected him softly. Right. Earth science." He chuckled, looking toward our parents to secure his audience. Susan and David offered polite, encouraging smiles. "Listen, I know things have been tight for you. Teaching does not exactly pay the big bills, and driving out to the farm must have put some serious wear and tear on that old clunker of yours. I noticed your front left tire is looking pretty bald." I took a slow sip of my ice water. I waited. "Once my payout from the commercial developer clears the escrow account next month." Carter continued, waving his hand magnanimously through the air. "I want to do something nice for you. I will buy you a brand new set of all-weather tires. Consider it a gift. I know Henry would want me to take care of my little sister since the estate went to me. It is the least I can do." The sheer audacity of his offer hung in the warm air of the dining room. He was offering to buy me rubber tires, using the ghost of a fortune he had stolen from me. He was playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy patriarch, tossing spare change to the impoverished sibling. My father stared down at his plate, suddenly very interested in cutting a small piece of roasted lamb. Susan beamed with maternal pride. She reached across the table and patted Carter's hand, telling him he had such a generous and forgiving spirit. I looked at the 3 of them. I saw a brother drowning in a high-interest truck loan he could not afford. I saw a mother orchestrating a massive real estate deal on land she had 0 legal authority to sell. I saw a father too paralyzed by his own cowardice to stop a moving train. They were spending ghosts. Every single dollar they were projecting, every luxury purchase, every smug promise was anchored to a piece of paper that was fundamentally worthless. They were building a towering financial structure on top of a legal fault line. The physical tension in my jaw was real, but I did not let it reach my eyes. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted a faint, metallic tang of blood. I did not throw my water glass in Carter's face. I did not stand up and expose the fraud. I simply offered him a polite, hollow smile. "That is very generous of you, Carter," I said. "I appreciate the thought." He toasted me with his Cabernet, looking incredibly pleased with his own performance. He had no idea that my silence was not submission. My silence was the sound of a trap being set. I was letting them dig themselves into a hole so deep, so fraught with financial liabilities and bank fraud, that they would never be able to climb out. While they were busy pricing out 1,500 acres of surface dirt, I was preparing to pull the rug out from under the entire state of North Dakota. Because earlier that same afternoon, I had walked into a small, dusty law office in town and handed that forged photocopy to the one man who already held the real keys to the kingdom. I left my parents' dining room that night with the taste of expensive Cabernet and cheap lies lingering in my mouth. My tires spun against the slick, icy asphalt as I pulled away from the curb, leaving Carter's $90,000 monument to his own ego parked in the driveway. The dashboard clock glowed a pale digital green. It was only 8 o'clock, but the North Dakota winter plunges the world into a deep, impenetrable dark before dinner is even served. I drove straight through the freezing night, the heater in my sedan struggling against the chill. My destination was not a bar, nor a friend's house to seek comfort. I was heading to a small, unassuming brick building on the edge of the historic district in downtown Bismarck. Calvin Reed ran his law practice out of a converted Victorian house. He was not a high-profile corporate litigator who wore silk ties and shouted in courtrooms. Calvin was a meticulous, graying estate attorney who favored tweed jackets and silence. He was the kind of lawyer who read every single footnote in a contract and remembered the names of his clients' grandchildren. My parents, in their arrogant rush to secure the farm, had assumed Calvin was just an old, irrelevant paper pusher. They thought they had successfully bypassed him by bringing their newly minted forged amendment directly to a different, less scrupulous local firm to begin the probate process. They believed they had effectively written Calvin out of the narrative. That was their second massive miscalculation. I parked my car under a flickering street lamp and walked up the salted brick path to Calvin's office. A single yellow light burned in the front window. He was waiting for me. I pushed open the heavy oak door, bringing a gust of frigid air inside with me. The office smelled intensely of stale drip coffee, lemon polish, and the distinct dry scent of thousands of aged paper files. Calvin sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. He looked up from a thick stack of manila folders, his expression solemn but sharp. He did not offer empty condolences or patronizing sympathy. He knew exactly why I was there. "Sit down, Elise," he said, gesturing to a worn leather chair opposite his desk. I took a seat, unbuttoning my winter coat. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folded photocopy Susan had handed me just days earlier. I smoothed the crease and slid the paper across the polished wood of his desk. Calvin picked it up. He did not gasp. He did not recoil in shock. He adjusted his glasses and spent 2 full minutes studying the ink at the bottom of the page. The silence stretched thick with anticipation. Finally, he set the paper down and looked at me. "Your brother always did have a distinct slant to his capital M," Calvin observed dryly, "and that tracing of your signature is frankly insulting to anyone with a passing knowledge of penmanship. He knows it is a forgery," I stated, my voice steady. "They are planning to file it with the county probate court next week to expedite the sale of the farm to the commercial developers." Calvin leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his stomach. A slow, grim smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Elise," he began, his voice taking on the measured tone of a professor explaining a complex legal precedent. "Your grandfather Henry was many things. He was a stubborn farmer, he was a tough negotiator, but above all, he was a deeply pragmatic man. He understood the fundamental nature of the soil he worked, and he understood the fundamental nature of the family he raised. Calvin opened a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a dark red wax stamp. He placed it carefully next to the forged photocopy. Henry visited me exactly 14 months ago, Calvin continued. His arthritis was flaring up badly. He could barely grip the door handle to get into my office, but his mind was razor sharp. He told me that he could see the writing on the wall. He knew his health was failing, and he knew exactly what your mother and brother would attempt to do the moment his heart stopped beating. He predicted they would try to force a sale of the acreage to fund Carter's delusions of grandeur. My breath hitched in my throat. I stared at the sealed envelope. What did he do? He removed the target from their backs entirely, Calvin replied, and he did it without telling them. 14 months ago, your grandfather executed a secret, ironclad federal trust. He placed the entirety of the 2,000-acre estate, including all assets, machinery, and mineral rights, directly into that trust. He tapped the thick envelope with his index finger. This document legally supersedes any prior or subsequent will amendments. It is bulletproof, and the sole irrevocable beneficiary of that trust is you, Elise. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The ground beneath my feet, which had felt so incredibly unstable since the night of his death, suddenly solidified into bedrock. Grandpa Henry had not just left me the farm, he had built a fortress around it, anticipating the exact siege my parents were currently mounting. But it gets better, Calvin said, a dangerous glint appearing in his eyes. Henry knew that if he simply filed a new will, Susan would hire a team of aggressive lawyers to contest it. She would claim undue influence. She would claim he was not of sound mind. She would drag the estate through years of grueling, expensive litigation. So Henry did not just ask me to draft the trust. He brought in an old friend to serve as the official witness and executor. Calvin paused, letting the weight of his next words hang in the air. He brought in Silas Thorne. I recognized the name immediately. Silas Thorne and my grandfather had grown up on neighboring farms. They had shipped off to the military together and returned to North Dakota to build their respective lives. While Henry chose the earth, Silas chose the law. Silas Thorne was not a local magistrate or a small-town judge. He was a highly respected, fiercely feared, sitting federal judge in the United States District Court. Judge Thorne personally witnessed the execution of this trust, Calvin explained. He signed the affidavits affirming your grandfather's complete and total mental competency. If your parents attempt to challenge the legitimacy of this document in open court, they will not be arguing against a small-town estate lawyer. They will be arguing against the sworn testimony of a sitting federal authority. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying precision. The forged document sitting on Calvin's desk was not a threat to my inheritance. It was a loaded weapon my family was pointing directly at their own heads. So we stop them, I said, leaning forward. We show them the trust. We stop the sale to the commercial developer before Carter ruins his life completely. Calvin shook his head slowly. The grim smile returned. No, Elise, he corrected me softly. We do not stop them. If we intervene now, they simply tear up the forgery and pretend it never happened. They will retreat, regroup, and find another way to attack the estate. Susan will launch a social campaign claiming you manipulated a dying man into changing his will. They will paint you as the villain for the rest of your life. He pointed a finger at the forged photocopy. Right now, that piece of paper is just a nasty family secret. It is not a crime until it is officially submitted to a judge. If we want to secure your future and protect your grandfather's legacy permanently, we must transition from a passive defense to an active, strategic ambush. I looked into Calvin's eyes. I saw the same cold, calculating patience that Grandpa Henry possessed when he waited for the winter freeze to break before planting his seeds. What is the strategy? I asked. We wait, Calvin answered simply. We let Carter drive his $90,000 truck. We let Susan negotiate with the Fargo developers. We let them revel in their stolen victory. And most importantly, we let David and Susan walk into the county courthouse, raise their right hands, and formally file that forged document into the public record under oath. The strategy was devastating. By allowing them to officially file the fraudulent paperwork, we were allowing them to cross the threshold from a civil dispute into undeniable documented felony perjury. Once that document received a county stamp, there was no retracting it. There was no pretending it was a misunderstanding. The trap would snap shut, and the jaws were made of federal law. "I agree," I said. "I want to hire you as my formal counsel." Calvin nodded, sliding a retainer agreement across the desk. I signed my name using the quick, chaotic blur of muscle memory I had developed over years of grading exams. The contrast between my real signature and the slow, deliberate tracing on the forgery was stark and undeniable. I walked out of Calvin Reed's office an hour later. The North Dakota night felt significantly less cold. I had arrived in downtown Bismarck as a disinherited granddaughter trying to defend a few memories. I was driving back to my apartment as the sole trustee of a 2,000-acre empire, armed with a legal trap designed by a federal judge. But even Calvin and I did not realize the full magnitude of the situation. We were focused on the surface acreage. We were focused on stopping a commercial developer from paving over the wheat fields. We did not know that the true value of the Mitchell farm was not sitting on top of the soil. It was buried deep underneath. And the very next morning, an executive in a tailored suit was going to arrive in town to show Carter exactly how to sell the floorboards while ignoring the gold mine hiding in the basement. The rhythm of a small North Dakota town changes the moment a stranger arrives wearing a tailored wool coat. It was a Tuesday morning when the black luxury rental SUV rolled down Main Street. The local gossip mill operates faster than broadband internet. By noon, everyone knew the driver was an acquisition scout from a prominent energy conglomerate based in Houston. Decades of watching the oil boom crest and fall taught the locals to spot a land buyer from a mile away. They carry expensive briefcases and order their steaks rare at the only decent restaurant in a 50-mile radius. My brother did not waste a single second. Carter possessed a predatory instinct for perceived wealth. He tracked the Texas executive down at the local diner before the lunch rush finished. Carter firmly believed his failed software ventures made him a ruthless corporate negotiator. He marched into that diner wearing his expensive leather jacket, projecting the unearned swagger of a man who owned the world. He cornered the executive in a booth. The entire town watched them talk. Carter did not understand the true nature of the energy industry. He only consumed flashy headlines about renewable resources and green infrastructure. He took one look at our sprawling 2,000 acres of flat, windy prairie and made a monumental assumption. He decided the Houston conglomerate wanted to purchase the acreage to construct a massive commercial wind farm. Carter spent 3 hours pitching himself as a visionary. He threw around tech buzzwords demanding premium pricing for the surface rights. He offered to sign a binding letter of intent right there over a plate of cold fries. The Texas executive just smiled. It was the calm, patient smile of a predator watching dinner walk itself onto a silver platter. The scout agreed to a preliminary surface purchase agreement for $1.2 million. Carter walked out of that diner looking like he had just conquered a small nation. He immediately began calling local contractors, bragging about his unparalleled business acumen. He genuinely thought he had squeezed a fortune out of a clueless, out-of-state corporation. He believed he was trading empty dirt for a kingdom. He did not realize he had just sold the floorboards while ignoring a gold mine hiding in the basement. I learned the truth 48 hours later. I was sitting at my desk in the high school science lab, grading a stack of freshman exams focused on sedimentary rock layers. The school secretary knocked gently on my open door. She handed me a thick, heavy envelope delivered via certified mail. The return address featured the embossed silver logo of the same Texas energy conglomerate. The letter was not addressed to my mother. It was not addressed to my brother. The crisp black font on the front of the envelope read, to the legal trustee of the Henry Mitchell Federal Estate. Carter was busy parading around town with a fraudulent piece of paper. The corporate legal departments do not rely on local gossip. They employ teams of specialized researchers who conduct exhaustive title searches before authorizing multi-million-dollar acquisitions. Those researchers had dug past the forged probate filing. They checked the federal databases. They uncovered the discreet, ironclad trust Calvin Reed had established more than a year ago. The energy company knew exactly who owned the land. They knew Carter was a loud, irrelevant distraction. I broke the seal and unfolded the heavy parchment. The proposal detailed inside had nothing to do with wind turbines or green energy. As an earth science teacher, I spend months educating teenagers about the Bakken Formation. It is a vast, subsurface, geologic structure spanning thousands of square miles across the Williston Basin. Deep beneath the crust layers of porous dolomite and siltstone act as a sponge, trapping immense reserves of crude oil. Extracting it requires deep horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Most farmers only own the surface dirt. They grow wheat and soy, remaining oblivious to the ocean of black wealth resting 2 miles below their boots. Grandpa Henry was different. When he purchased his acreage decades ago, he fought tooth and nail to secure the subsurface mineral rights. He owned the land all the way down to the earth core. The Texas conglomerate had conducted a proprietary seismic survey of our county. They identified a massive, untapped pocket of high-yield shale resting directly beneath my grandfather's wheat fields. They did not care about the wind blowing over the topsoil. They wanted the crude oil trapped in the stone. The letter in my hands contained a formal offer to lease the subsurface mineral rights. The initial signing bonus alone was staggering. Combined with the proposed percentage of production royalties, the actual value of the dirt Carter had so eagerly offered up was roughly $12 million. My brother had negotiated a $1.2 million surface deal, acting like a tyrant over pocket change, while casually discarding an empire worth 10 times that amount. The dramatic irony was heavy enough to alter the gravitational pull of the room. I sat in my empty classroom staring at the formal legal offer, listening to the distant sound of students laughing in the hallway. My family thought they had successfully erased my future. Instead, their desperate rush for a quick payout had blinded them to the greatest financial asset our bloodline had ever possessed. That Friday night, Carter rented out the back room of the local tavern to celebrate his brilliant negotiation. He purchased expensive imported beer for anyone willing to listen to his inflated ego. He stood on a wooden chair, raising a glass, giving a loud speech about progress, innovation, and taking bold risks. Susan and David sat at a corner booth, beaming with maternal and paternal pride. They looked at my brother like he was a savior. I attended the gathering. I stood quietly near the back wall, holding a simple glass of club soda with lime. I watched Carter slap the town mayor on the back. I watched my mother accept congratulations from her friends on raising such a successful, business-minded son. Carter spotted me near the exit. He pushed his way through the crowded room, his face flushed with alcohol and unearned victory. He leaned in close, smelling of sour beer and cheap cologne. "You should be taking notes, Elise," he said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "This is how the real world works. You have to move fast. You have to recognize value before anyone else does. That is the difference between a leader and a school teacher." I took a slow sip of my club soda. I looked at his expensive boots. I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from his posture. He was standing on top of a $12 million lottery ticket, bragging about finding a crumpled $20 bill in the gutter. "You are right," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. "Recognizing hidden value is a rare skill." He laughed, assuming I was finally conceding defeat. He patted my shoulder with heavy, patronizing condescension and walked back toward his adoring audience. I did not feel angry. I felt an eerie, profound sense of calm. The trap Calvin and I set was no longer just about protecting my grandfather's legacy. It was about letting Carter's own blinding pride construct his personal gallows. He had signed a preliminary letter of intent with a massive corporation. He had made legally binding promises regarding land he did not own. When the energy company eventually rejected his surface deal in favor of my subsurface rights, the resulting corporate backlash would crush him. I walked out of the tavern before the celebration ended. The cold night air felt refreshing against my skin. The stars over the North Dakota plains were sharp and bright, indifferent to the petty greed unfolding below them. I knew the silence could not last forever. I knew that my calm demeanor, my refusal to engage in screaming matches or public tears, was beginning to unnerve the orchestrator of this entire scheme. Susan was highly observant. She expected me to crumble. She expected a lawsuit, a fight, a desperate plea for my rightful share. My total lack of resistance was a variable she had not accounted for. As the weekend approached, her maternal pride began to curdle into deep, creeping paranoia. She started watching me from a distance, trying to decipher the puzzle of my quiet acceptance. Her suspicion was about to ignite a smear campaign designed to force my hand, bringing the conflict out of the shadows and onto the main street of our small town. The paranoia creeping into Susan Mitchell's mind was inevitable. She possessed a terrifying instinct for self-preservation and had spent her entire adult life curating a flawless image among the local community. She understood that my refusal to argue with her in the living room was a glaring anomaly. People who have just been stripped of their birthright are supposed to yell. They are supposed to threaten lawsuits. They are supposed to act erratic and unpredictable. My calm departure unsettled her deeply. That lingering fear metastasized into panic when a neighbor happened to spot my rusted sedan parked under the flickering street lamp outside Calvin Reed's law office in downtown Bismarck. Small towns function like interconnected nervous systems. A rumor whispered in a driveway on Tuesday morning becomes established gospel by Wednesday afternoon. Susan realized I was consulting an attorney. Instead of waiting to see my legal strategy, she decided to burn my reputation to the ground before I could ever speak a single word in my own defense. She launched a preemptive strike designed to isolate me, discredit me, and paint me as a bitter antagonist trying to ruin my own flesh and blood. Her campaign was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She did not take out an advertisement in the local paper. She weaponized casual conversations. She stood in the produce aisle of the local grocery store, holding a head of iceberg lettuce, and let tears pool in her eyes while talking to the choir director. She sat in the basement of the Methodist church during the weekly bake sale and dabbed her cheeks with a tissue. She spun a fabricated, tragic narrative, portraying Carter as a struggling visionary entrepreneur trying desperately to save the family legacy. In her version of reality, I was a spoiled, ungrateful child. She told anyone who would listen that I was contesting my grandfather's dying wishes purely out of spite. She claimed I was demanding a massive cash payout from my brother because I wanted to abandon my teaching job and fund a lavish, luxurious lifestyle in a coastal city. The lie was remarkably effective because it played into the inherent biases of the community. Carter drove a luxury truck and wore expensive clothes, which projected an illusion of success. I drove a decaying car and lived in a modest apartment. To the casual observer, her story made perfect sense. The wealthy brother was trying to build something, and the jealous sister was trying to tear it down for a quick payday. I felt the atmospheric shift before anyone ever said a word to my face. The social temperature in our community dropped to freezing. I spent my days standing in front of high school freshmen teaching them about tectonic plates and volcanic soil, pretending I did not notice the strange, judgmental looks their parents gave me in the pickup line. The true depth of my isolation became painfully clear on a Saturday morning. I drove into town to run errands. The sky was a pale, bruised gray, threatening another heavy snowstorm. I parked on Main Street and walked into the local diner. The establishment was a cornerstone of the community. It smelled of fried bacon, strong black coffee, and industrial floor cleaner. I had eaten breakfast in that exact room every Saturday since I was 10 years old. I pushed the glass door open. The brass bell attached to the frame jingled brightly. The low hum of morning conversation died instantly. It was not a gradual quieting. It was a sudden, unnatural silence. Dozens of heads turned in my direction. The man who owned the hardware store lowered his newspaper and stared at me with open disdain. The woman who ran the local pharmacy leaned across her booth and whispered something behind her hand to her husband. I stood in the entryway, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of their collective judgment. They looked at me as if I were a thief who had just walked into a vault. Susan had done her job perfectly. She had transformed me into a pariah. The urge to turn around and run back out into the freezing cold was overwhelming. My chest tightened and my pulse hammered against my throat. But I remembered my grandfather. I remembered his calloused hands packing frozen dirt into a plastic testing tube. I remembered his advice to let other people do the talking. I kept my chin level. I walked past the silent booths, the floorboards creaking under my boots. I took a seat on a red vinyl stool at the far end of the counter. I kept my eyes fixed on the laminated menu sitting between the salt and pepper shakers. I could feel their stares drilling into my back. I knew they were waiting for me to crack. They wanted a performance. They wanted the hysterical, greedy sister to make a scene. A waitress stepped out from the kitchen holding a steaming glass pot of coffee. Her name was Maya. She was a 22-year-old single mother who worked 50 hours a week to keep the heat running in her trailer. 3 years ago, she had enrolled in a night school program to earn her high school equivalency diploma. Earth science was her final required credit. She had struggled deeply with the material, overwhelmed by the complex terminology of erosion and mineral deposits. I had stayed late every Tuesday evening for 4 months, sitting with her in the empty school library, drawing diagrams of the Williston Basin on a whiteboard, until the concepts finally clicked. She passed her final exam with flying colors. Maya walked down the length of the counter. She did not look at the other patrons. She did not acknowledge the oppressive, hostile silence filling the room. She stopped directly in front of me and pulled a heavy ceramic mug from the shelf below the register. She poured the coffee until it steamed near the brim. She set the mug down gently in front of me. Then she reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small plastic creamer, and placed it next to my hand. "This one is on the house," Elise Maya said. Her voice was steady and clear, ringing out across the quiet diner. She looked me directly in the eyes. She did not ask about the rumors. She did not pry into the gossip surrounding my family. She simply offered a warm, deliberate nod of solidarity. It was a fleeting, microscopic gesture, but in that freezing room, it felt like a roaring fire. Maya knew the person I actually was. She knew I was the teacher who stayed late on freezing nights to help a struggling mother pass a test. She knew that loud, theatrical lies could never overwrite quiet, consistent kindness. I wrapped my hands around the hot ceramic mug, letting the warmth seep into my numb fingers. "Thank you, Maya," I replied softly. The conversation in the diner slowly resumed, returning as a low, uncomfortable murmur. I drank my coffee in peace. That tiny pebble of human decency provided me with all the armor I needed. I realized that the town watching my every move was not a disadvantage. It was a necessary component of the strategy. If I fought back against the rumors, Susan would point to my defensive anger as proof of my guilt. If I tried to explain the forgery to the townspeople, I would tip my hand and ruin the legal trap Calvin had constructed. My only viable path forward was absolute stoicism. I had to wear the villain costume Susan had tailored for me. I had to let Carter play the conquering hero. I had to project total defeat. I finished my coffee, left a generous tip on the counter for Maya, and walked back out into the biting winter wind. I felt a profound sense of clarity. The social isolation was painful, but it was temporary. Every dirty look, every whispered insult, every turned shoulder was serving a greater purpose. Susan was building a towering narrative based on the assumption that she held all the cards. Her successful smear campaign was making her incredibly bold. She felt invincible. She felt so secure in her fabricated reality that she was ready to take the final fatal step. She and David were no longer hesitating. Emboldened by the town supporting their lies, they scheduled an appointment for Monday morning. They were going to walk through the heavy wooden doors of the county courthouse. They were going to stand before a probate clerk, raise their right hands, and swear under penalty of perjury that the forged document was authentic. They were about to hand Calvin Reed the exact weapon he needed to destroy them. The waiting period was officially over. The trap was set. Monday morning arrived with a clear, brittle sky. The temperature hovered near zero, freezing the morning dew onto the bare branches of the oak trees outside my classroom window. I stood near the chalkboard, wiping away the remnants of a diagram illustrating continental drift. I was physically present in the high school, breathing in the scent of chalk dust and floor wax, but my mind was miles away. I knew exactly where my parents were. At 10 o'clock, the county courthouse opened its heavy brass doors. Susan and David walked up the granite steps. I could picture my mother wearing her tailored wool coat, her chin held high, projecting the image of a grieving, responsible matriarch. My father likely trailed a half step behind her, keeping his eyes fixed on the pavement, preferring the cold stone to the judgmental gaze of the public. They navigated the marble hallways and approached the probate clerk. Filing an amendment to a will is not a casual transaction. You do not just slide a piece of paper across a wooden counter and walk away. The clerk requires identification. The clerk requires a sworn oath. Susan and David had to place their hands on a Bible or raise their right hands to the ceiling. They had to swear, under penalty of perjury, that the document they were submitting was the true, unaltered, final wish of Henry Mitchell. They looked a government official in the eye and lied. They handed over the forgery. The clerk reviewed the signatures, picked up a heavy metal date stamp, and pressed it firmly against the top right corner of the page. That sharp, metallic thud echoed across the county records. The nature of the conflict transformed in that fraction of a second. It was no longer a greedy family secret hidden in a leather tote bag. It was an irrevocable felony. My phone vibrated in my pocket right before the lunch bell rang. I stepped into the empty science supply closet to answer the call. The space was cramped, smelling of preserved specimens and rubbing alcohol. Calvin Reed spoke with quiet, chilling efficiency. They filed it, Elise. Both of them signed the sworn affidavits. The clerk recorded the amendment into the public register 20 minutes ago. I closed my eyes and leaned the back of my head against the cool plaster wall. A profound sense of finality washed over me. I felt a fleeting pang of sorrow for my father, wishing he had found a single ounce of courage to stop my mother. But pity does not change the law. I thanked Calvin and ended the call. The first phase of the trap was successfully triggered. While my parents were busy committing perjury in the courthouse, my brother was busy constructing his own personal guillotine across town. Carter scheduled a formal meeting with the executives from the Texas Energy conglomerate. They secured the private conference room at the only upscale hotel in our county. Carter wore a new designer suit bought on credit. He carried a leather briefcase containing nothing but his own inflated ego. The Houston executives slid a thick, bound document across the mahogany table. It was a preliminary letter of intent. This document outlined the formal terms of the proposed land acquisition. It detailed the $12 million valuation for the subsurface mineral rights. More importantly, it contained standard corporate indemnification clauses. By signing that document, Carter was providing a legally binding guarantee that he possessed the clear, unencumbered title to the entire Mitchell estate. He was promising a multi-billion-dollar corporation that no other claims, trusts, or liens existed on the property. Carter did not hire a lawyer to review the paperwork. His arrogance convinced him he was the smartest man in the room. He clicked his expensive gold pen and initialed every single page. He signed his name on the final line with a flourish. He legally bound himself to deliver a sprawling empire he did not own. To celebrate his triumphant corporate conquest, Carter rented out the entire main floor of the local tavern that evening. The venue was usually a quiet place for roughnecks and farmers to unwind, but Carter transformed it into a shrine honoring his own perceived brilliance. He ordered top-shelf liquor. He hired a local band to play in the corner. He invited half the town to bask in his glory. I did not attend the celebration, but I drove past the tavern on my way home from the grocery store. The neon signs buzzed brightly against the dark winter night. The parking lot was packed with pickup trucks and sedans. Through the frosted glass windows, I could see the silhouette of my brother standing on the bar. He was holding a bottle of champagne in one hand and a cigar in the other. He was shouting something to the cheering crowd. He was bathing in the admiration of the same townspeople who had cast me out just days prior. I parked my old sedan across the street, letting the engine idle in the freezing dark. I watched the golden child revel in his stolen fortune. I watched him buy drinks for men who would soon pretend they never knew him. Have you ever watched someone dig their own grave while bragging about the quality of the shovel? I rested my hands on the steering wheel. The leather was cold under my palms. I felt the steady hum of the engine vibrating through my boots. The waiting was over. The passive endurance was finished. Susan and David had locked themselves into a perjury charge. Carter had signed a fraudulent contract with an energy titan. They had built a towering skyscraper of lies, and they had neglected to check the foundation. I shifted the car into drive. I drove back to my quiet apartment. The transition began. No more silence, no more retreats. I opened my laptop. I drafted an email to Calvin Reed. One sentence: execute the next phase. The pacing of my life shifted. The slow, creeping dread evaporated. Sharp, decisive action took its place. Calvin received the email. He drafted the legal notices. He prepared the injunctions. The documents were printed. The envelopes were sealed. The certified mail labels were attached. The trap was fully loaded. The target was perfectly aligned. The hammer was drawn back. The execution required no emotion. It required no shouting. It only required the truth. And the truth was about to arrive on their doorsteps. The execution of a legal strike does not happen with a loud explosion. It happens in total silence. It is the subtle click of a computer mouse. It is the soft thud of a courier dropping a manila folder onto a receptionist's desk. On Tuesday morning at precisely 9 o'clock, Calvin Reed unleashed the paperwork we had spent days preparing. He did not send polite inquiries. He deployed formal cease and desist orders. He targeted 3 specific destinations simultaneously. The first envelope arrived at the local probate court, freezing the estate processing and halting any transfer of deeds. The second notice was wired directly to the legal department of the Houston Energy Conglomerate, legally informing them that the man who signed their letter of intent lacked the authority to sell a single blade of grass. But the third target was the most critical. Calvin dispatched a binding injunction straight to the Risk Management Division of the First National Bank. This was the institution holding the keys to my family's premature spending spree. Carter had spent the past 2 weeks operating on a temporary high-interest line of credit. He had used the forged will and the impending farm sale as his collateral. On this specific Tuesday morning, he was sitting inside the glass-walled office of the premier auto dealership in town. He was drinking complimentary sparkling water, wearing his designer suit, preparing to finalize the permanent financing for his luxury truck. I know how the scene unfolded because the financing manager is the father of one of my earth science students. He told me the details later. Carter was boasting about his corporate conquests. He clicked his gold pen, ready to sign the final contract. The manager typed Carter's routing number into the dealership portal to process the primary down payment. The screen did not generate a confirmation receipt. It generated a stark, glaring error code. The bank had received Calvin's injunction. When a financial institution is notified of a severe ownership dispute involving felony forgery and federal trusts, they do not take risks. They protect their own assets. The bank instantly froze every single account connected to the Mitchell estate. They locked down Carter's checking. They froze his business credit lines. They halted his temporary bridge loans. Carter sat in that glass office and watched his entire manufactured reality vaporize in real time. The financing manager politely informed him that the transaction was declined. Carter demanded they run the numbers again. He shouted at the staff. He pulled out his phone to call his personal banker. only to be routed to an automated message stating his accounts were under legal review. He had to stand up, walk out of that plush office, and hand the keys to his pristine black truck back to the sales associate in front of a showroom full of customers. The oxygen was cut. The financial bleeding had begun. My phone started ringing at exactly 11:14. I was sitting at my desk eating a cold turkey sandwich during my free period. The screen illuminated, displaying Susan Mitchell's contact photo. I did not answer. I took a bite of my lunch and watched the screen vibrate across the scarred wooden surface of my desk. It stopped. Then it started ringing again, 3 consecutive times. I let every single call divert to the automated answering service. 5 minutes later, a voicemail notification appeared. I put on my headphones. I pressed play. I needed to hear the exact tone of her voice. I needed to measure the depth of the panic. The woman speaking on that recording was not the polished, grieving matriarch who had charmed the local church choir. The carefully curated performance was gone. The mask had slipped, shattered, and fallen away entirely. Elise. Her voice was a shrill, breathless shriek. What did you do? What kind of sick, twisted game are you playing right now? The bank just called your father. They froze the equity line. They froze Carter's accounts. Do you have any idea what you have done? She paused, gasping for air. The background noise indicated she was pacing rapidly across her hardwood floors. You are trying to destroy this family because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of your brother. You could not stand seeing him succeed. So you hired some local hack lawyer to file frivolous paperwork and ruin his corporate deal. You are a spiteful, bitter little girl. I am going to sue you for everything you own. I am going to make sure you never teach in this county again. Call me back right now and fix this. The recording ended with a sharp, violent click. I sat in the quiet classroom, listening to the static hum of the empty audio file. I did not feel a spike of adrenaline. I felt the cool, analytical satisfaction of a scientist observing a chemical reaction proceed exactly as hypothesized. Susan was not operating from a position of strength. Her vicious threats were empty posturing. People who hold the winning hand do not scream into a telephone. They simply play their cards. Her venom was a direct byproduct of profound, suffocating desperation. To understand her panic, you have to understand the math of their betrayal. My parents and my brother had not just planned to spend the money, they had already spent it. When Carter signed the preliminary letter of intent with the Houston executives, he promised them clear title to the farm. Based on that promise, he took out massive short-term bridge loans to fund his lifestyle and pay off his previous failed business debts. Susan and David had done the exact same thing. They had borrowed heavily against their anticipated share of the surface payout to cover a mountain of hidden credit card debt they had accumulated over the past 5 years to maintain their wealthy facade. Bridge loans are designed to cover a brief gap between a major purchase and an impending payout. They carry predatory interest rates. They require immediate repayment the second the deal closes. By dropping the cease and desist, Calvin and I had obliterated the payout. The Houston deal was dead in the water. But the predatory debt remained. The interest was compounding daily. My family was suddenly staring down the barrel of hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest liabilities, and their only source of collateral was currently locked inside a federal trust bearing my name. They were drowning. I had not raised my voice. I had not sent an angry text message. I had not confronted them in a crowded diner. I had simply filed the truth, and the truth had drained the water from their pool while they were standing on the diving board. I took off my headphones and finished my sandwich. The bell rang, signaling the start of the next period. My freshman students filed into the room, dropping their heavy backpacks onto the linoleum floor. I stood up, picked up a piece of white chalk, and began drawing a diagram of soil erosion on the board. I knew Susan's screaming voicemail was only the opening salvo. The initial shock of the frozen bank accounts was going to wear off by nightfall. The harsh reality of their financial ruin would set in, and the finger-pointing would begin. Carter was a man who refused to take responsibility for a single mistake in his entire life. When the creditors started calling his cell phone, he was not going to blame himself. He was going to look for a scapegoat. He was going to turn on the two people who had convinced him the forgery was a flawless plan. The alliance between my mother, my father, and my golden child brother was built entirely on the promise of stolen wealth. Without the money to hold them together, their loyalty to one another was going to disintegrate. I just needed to apply one more layer of structural pressure to watch the entire family unit collapse inward. Calvin Reed was already drafting the documents. We were not going to wait for them to find a new lawyer. We were not going to let them control the narrative in the local community any longer. We were preparing to drag them out of the shadows and place them under the brightest, most unforgiving spotlight in the legal system. They had signed their names to a lie. Now they were going to have to swear under oath and explain the origin of those signatures while a court reporter documented every single stammering, sweating syllable. Legal strangulation requires profound patience. You do not win a protracted war by swinging wildly in the dark. You win by applying steady, inescapable pressure until the target stops struggling and simply collapses under their own weight. Calvin Reed understood this fundamental principle of combat. 3 days after we successfully froze their bank accounts and severed their financial oxygen, we escalated the strategy. We transitioned from attacking their stolen wealth to threatening their personal freedom. We issued subpoenas. Process servers do not care about your social standing. They do not call ahead to schedule a convenient window of time. They arrive unannounced, carrying thick manila envelopes that contain court-ordered mandates. On Thursday afternoon, a licensed server tracked Carter down at a local coffee shop. My brother was nursing a black drip coffee he could barely afford, sitting alone at a small table. The server dropped the heavy envelope directly onto the wood in front of him. A second server intercepted Susan in the frozen food aisle of the town grocery store. She was forced to accept the legal documents while her wealthy friends watched the humiliating exchange from near the bakery counter. My father received his paperwork while standing on the front porch of his own home, signing the delivery receipt with trembling hands. These envelopes did not contain gentle requests for mediation. They contained formal, unyielding deposition mandates. The legal text required Susan David and Carter to appear at Calvin's law office on a specific Tuesday morning. They would be forced to sit inside a windowless conference room, raise their right hands, and answer forensic questions under the penalty of perjury. A licensed court reporter would be sitting in the corner, transcribing every single stammering syllable onto the public record. Calvin was preparing to dissect their fabricated reality with surgical precision. He was not going to ask broad philosophical questions about my grandfather. He was going to ask them the exact brand of the pen Henry supposedly used to sign the amendment. He would demand to know the specific time of day the signature took place. He would inquire about the lighting in the room, the angle of the paper, and the physical movements of an elderly man whose arthritic joints were so inflamed he could barely manage to hold a ceramic coffee mug. Liars can memorize a general narrative, but they always fracture when forced to recount the microscopic, mundane details under hostile cross-examination. Susan might possess the sociopathic discipline to sit under those fluorescent lights and spin a flawless deception. Carter might carry enough blinding arrogance to believe he could outsmart a seasoned litigator. But my father lacked both armor and intellect. David was the structural weak point in their criminal architecture. David was a man who spent his entire adult existence shrinking away from friction. He navigated his marriage by simply surrendering to Susan's endless demands, buying his domestic tranquility by sacrificing his own spine. He followed her orders because obedience was much easier than standing up for what was right. He had stood in that living room, wrapping silver spoons, allowing my mother to hand me a forged piece of paper. He thought his silence absolved him of the crime. Facing a disappointed spouse is one thing. Facing a severe federal indictment is an entirely different universe. The looming reality of a prison sentence has a unique way of shattering a lifetime of passive compliance. Geologic pressure builds for centuries before a fault line finally snaps. Human pressure operates on a much faster timeline. David cracked first. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed bright red in the dark bedroom. It was 2 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. My phone vibrated against the bedside table, emitting a low, urgent hum. I did not reach for the device. I lay perfectly still beneath the heavy winter quilt, watching the screen illuminate the shadows on my ceiling. The ringing stopped. A minute later, the new voicemail icon appeared on the glass display. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. I wrapped a thick wool shawl around my shoulders, picked up the phone, and tapped the play button. The audio file began with a long, shaky exhalation. It sounded like a man who had forgotten how to draw oxygen into his lungs. "Elise, it is your dad." His tone was pathetic. It was a chaotic blend of exhaustion, primal fear, and manufactured affection. "Please pick up. Look, things have gotten out of hand. This whole lawyer situation is tearing us apart. Your mother is sick over this. Carter is losing his mind. We are family, Elise. We are supposed to protect each other. We are not supposed to drag each other into courtrooms. I am begging you. Just call your attorney and drop the injunctions. Let us handle this privately, for the sake of family peace. Please." I deleted the message without a second thought. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt. I felt the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a highly predictable chemical reaction. David was not begging for family peace. He was begging for amnesty. He wanted me to save him from the consequences of a felony he had willingly enabled. His sudden desire for unity was nothing more than a desperate attempt to avoid wearing a bright orange jumpsuit in a state penitentiary. I sat in the dark room, quietly mapping the fault lines of their unholy alliance. The psychological warfare was doing the heavy lifting for me. By forcing them into a corner with the deposition subpoenas, Calvin and I had introduced the ultimate wedge into their household: self-preservation. I knew exactly how my brother operated. Carter viewed loyalty as a transactional currency. He loved our parents fiercely when they were handing him the keys to a 2,000-acre kingdom. He adored Susan when she was shielding him from his own endless string of failures. But the moment the silver platter turned into a steel trap, his affection would evaporate into thin air. He was a narcissist staring down the barrel of a fraud charge. Narcissists do not go down with the sinking ship. They steal the only remaining lifeboat and paddle away while watching the loyal crew drown in the freezing water. I knew with absolute certainty that Carter would throw his mother and father under the bus the second the threat of actual jail time became a tangible reality. I could only imagine the vicious, terrifying environment unfolding behind the closed doors of my childhood home. The polite, wealthy facade they projected to the town was undoubtedly crumbling into ashes. Susan was likely screaming at David for showing weakness. Carter was undoubtedly pacing the hardwood floors, blaming his mother for executing a sloppy forgery, blaming his father for not doing enough to stop my retaliation. They were trapped inside a burning building of their own design, and the exits were securely bolted from the outside. The deposition date was approaching rapidly. The silence from my end was deafening to them. They realized their vicious threats could not intimidate me. They realized my father's pathetic begging could not sway my resolve. They were standing on the very edge of a legal cliff, and Calvin Reed was preparing to push them over the precipice. They realized they could not walk into that conference room alone. They needed a shield. They needed professional representation to navigate the impending sworn testimony and figure out a way to quash the subpoenas before they were forced to speak on the record. But there was a glaring, insurmountable obstacle standing directly in their path. Premium legal defense requires premium capital. A high-powered litigation firm demands a hefty retainer fee up front before they ever look at a case file. Thanks to the bank freeze we executed days prior, Susan, David, and Carter possessed zero liquidity. Their checking accounts were locked. Their credit cards were suspended. Their equity lines were frozen solid. They were millionaires on a fraudulent piece of paper, but in reality, they could not afford to buy a tank of gas. Desperation breeds terrible decisions. Forced to find a legal advocate with empty pockets, they would have to scrape the bottom of the professional barrel. They were about to hire a cheap, aggressive local lawyer, desperate enough to take on a radioactive case on a deferred payment plan. They were preparing to walk into the fight of their lives, armed with a dull knife. They were completely unaware that my grandfather's oldest friend was waiting in the wings, ready to drop a devastating verdict on their fragile legal defense. The swift collapse of a fragile alliance is a fascinating event to witness. When you sever the financial arteries of a proud family, they do not gracefully accept defeat. They crawl toward the cheapest available lifeline. Susan and David Mitchell were legally paralyzed. The sweeping bank freeze Calvin Reed executed left their premium credit cards declining at grocery store registers. They could no longer afford the sleek, polished law firms occupying the high-rise buildings in downtown Bismarck. Those elite attorneys demand upfront retainers paid in certified funds. My parents were reduced to scouring the local directory for a discount litigator willing to take a high-stakes probate case on a contingency basis. They found Marcus Greer. He operated his legal practice out of a fading strip mall flanked by a discount auto parts store and a dry cleaner. Marcus wore shiny polyester suits and treated the law like a blunt instrument. His primary legal strategy involved bullying opposing counsel with endless, frivolous paperwork until they surrendered out of sheer exhaustion. He was a man who built a mediocre career defending petty theft and disputing minor traffic collisions. Carter undoubtedly fed Marcus a wildly distorted version of reality. My brother likely sat in that dingy strip mall office, projecting his false bravado, painting me as a jealous, unstable school teacher throwing a baseless legal tantrum. Marcus, smelling a potential cut of a lucrative farm sale, took the bait. He drafted a motion to quash the deposition subpoenas. His legal filing was a masterpiece of ignorant arrogance. He submitted the paperwork to the county clerk on a Thursday morning. A copy arrived via courier at Calvin Reed's office by noon. I sat across from Calvin holding a warm cup of black tea as he read the document aloud. Marcus Greer claimed I lacked the legal standing to request depositions. He argued that since the newly filed amendment explicitly removed me from the estate, I was nothing more than an estranged, disgruntled relative weaponizing the judicial system to harass the rightful heirs. He demanded the judge dismiss the subpoenas immediately. He even included a motion for sanctions, threatening to penalize Calvin for filing a frivolous injunction. Marcus thought he was intimidating a small-town estate planner. He assumed Calvin would fold under the threat of professional sanctions. He did not realize he was poking a sleeping bear with a very short stick. Calvin finished reading the motion, set the paper down on his mahogany desk, and offered a soft, dry chuckle. He reached for his desk phone. "It is time," Calvin said. He dialed a number he had kept memorized for over a decade. The man on the other end of the line did not live in North Dakota anymore. He resided in a quiet, highly secured neighborhood outside of Washington, D.C. Silas Thorne and my grandfather Henry survived the brutal blizzard of 1978 by burning wooden fence posts inside a stranded pickup truck. They shared a bond forged in frozen earth and prairie grit. Henry chose to spend his life harvesting wheat. Silas chose to study constitutional law. Silas possessed a brilliant, unforgiving mind. He climbed the judicial ranks with terrifying speed, eventually earning a lifetime appointment to the United States District Court. He was a sitting federal judge known for handing down verdicts that echoed like gunshots. Silas had quietly entered semi-retirement, taking senior status on the bench. But he stepped entirely back into the fray the moment Calvin called. He had been waiting for this exact moment for 14 months. The federal legal system operates with a profound, terrifying efficiency when a senior judge decides to act. Silas did not just write a casual letter of support. He drafted a comprehensive sworn affidavit. He signed it in the presence of federal clerks. He stamped it with the official seal of his office. He overnighted the physical document directly to Calvin via a secured federal courier. I was present in the county courthouse the following Tuesday morning when Marcus Greer learned a very harsh lesson about picking his battles. The presiding county judge had scheduled a preliminary hearing to review the motion to quash. The courtroom was practically empty, smelling of lemon polish and aged wood. Marcus strutted down the center aisle carrying a scuffed leather briefcase. Carter walked closely behind him, wearing a tailored suit, projecting the smug satisfaction of a man who believed his discount lawyer was about to secure his stolen fortune. Susan and David sat in the front row of the gallery, whispering to each other, their faces tight with nervous anticipation. Calvin and I sat at the petitioner table. I wore a simple gray blazer. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I did not look at my family. Marcus approached our table before the judge entered the room. He leaned over the wooden divider, a condescending smirk plastered across his face. He told Calvin he was willing to withdraw the motion for sanctions if we dropped the injunctions and walked away quietly. He spoke to us like we were confused children. Calvin did not say a word. He simply reached into his pristine briefcase and pulled out a single thick folder. He handed it to Marcus. "This is our formal response to your motion to quash," Calvin stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. Marcus snatched the folder. He flipped it open, expecting to find a standard legal brief filled with local case law precedents. He expected a desperate plea for standing. Instead, his eyes landed on a stark, immaculate sheet of heavy stock paper. At the top center of the page sat the unmistakable embossed gold seal of the United States District Court. I watched the physical transformation of Marcus Greer in real time. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His eyes widened as he scanned the first paragraph. The document was the sworn affidavit of Judge Silas Thorne. Silas did not mince words. The legal text was a masterclass in judicial destruction. Silas swore under penalty of federal law that he had personally witnessed Henry Mitchell execute an irrevocable federal trust 14 months prior. He outlined the exact timeline. He detailed his own observations of my grandfather's mental acuity, destroying any future argument of dementia or confusion. He confirmed that Elise Mitchell was the sole legal beneficiary of the entire estate. But the true fatal blow landed on the second page. Silas addressed the fabricated amendment my parents had filed. He wrote that he had known Henry Mitchell for 60 years. He had watched rheumatoid arthritis ravage Henry's joints. He stated unequivocally that the fluid, pristine signature presented to the probate court was a physical impossibility. He summarized the forgery with a single, devastating sentence. "The signature submitted by the respondents is a clumsy, pathetic tracing that insults the legacy of a man whose hands built this county." Marcus stood frozen in the aisle. He was holding a document signed by a federal authority that explicitly accused his clients of committing felony fraud and perjury. The implications crashed down upon him like a concrete wall. Marcus was a sleazy lawyer, but he was not a stupid one. He knew the strict ethical guidelines governing the State Bar Association. An attorney cannot knowingly represent clients who have submitted fraudulent documents to a court of law. If Marcus stood before the presiding judge and continued to argue that the forged amendment was legitimate, he would become an active participant in the perjury. He would be risking his own law license. He would be inviting a federal inquiry into his own practice. He slowly lowered the folder. He looked at Carter. The golden child was still smirking, completely oblivious to the radioactive bomb his discount lawyer was holding. Marcus then looked at Susan and David in the gallery. He saw them for what they truly were. They were not wealthy victims of a jealous daughter. They were desperate, broke felons who had just dragged him into a career-ending catastrophe. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff announced the arrival of the presiding county judge. Everyone in the room stood up. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The power dynamic had flipped in the span of 90 seconds. Susan, David, and Carter had walked into that courthouse believing they were swatting away a minor annoyance. They believed they were bullying a quiet high school science teacher. They did not realize until this exact moment that they were actually engaged in a bare-knuckle brawl with the highest tiers of the federal legal system. The judge took his seat and adjusted his robes. He looked down at the two legal tables, asking if the parties were ready to proceed with the motion to quash. Marcus Greer did not step up to the podium. He stood at the defense table, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the manila folder. He looked like a man staring down the headlights of an oncoming freight train. He had a profound choice to make in the next 10 seconds. He could fall on his sword for a family that could not even afford to pay his hourly rate, or he could save his own skin. He opened his mouth to speak, and the entire architecture of my family's defense prepared to crumble into dust. The instinct for professional survival overrides every other human impulse. Marcus Greer stood at the defense table, holding the affidavit signed by a sitting federal authority. He stared at the crisp embossed gold seal. His brain rapidly processed the dire trajectory of his immediate future. He was looking at disbarment federal fraud charges and the catastrophic end of his mediocre career. He did not ask for a brief recess. He did not request a moment to consult with his clients. He simply placed the document back onto the wooden table, reached for his scuffed leather briefcase, and snapped the brass latches shut. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the quiet courtroom. Marcus looked up at the presiding county judge. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke. He stated that he was filing an emergency oral motion to withdraw as legal counsel for the respondents, effective immediately. He cited irreconcilable ethical conflicts. In the legal profession, that specific phrase is a glowing neon sign. It alerts the judge that the clients have lied, fabricated evidence, or demanded the attorney participate in a crime. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening into granite. He looked past Marcus, aiming a terrifying glare directly at my parents sitting in the gallery. The judge granted the withdrawal without a single second of hesitation. Susan jumped to her feet. The tailored wool coat she wore suddenly looked oversized, as if she were shrinking inside it. She demanded to know what was happening. The judge banged his gavel, threatening her with contempt if she spoke out of turn. He formally advised the respondents that they were now proceeding pro se, meaning they were representing themselves in a complex fraud and perjury investigation. He warned them to find new representation before the formal probate hearing, which was scheduled to commence in less than 72 hours. Marcus did not wait for the court to adjourn. He grabbed his coat and practically sprinted down the center aisle. Carter chased after him. Susan and David followed closely behind, their dress shoes echoing frantically against the marble floor. I remained seated next to Calvin Reed. We packed our files in unhurried silence. By the time we exited through the heavy wooden double doors, the confrontation in the hallway was already underway. Marcus was standing near the elevators, stabbing the down button with his index finger. Carter was crowding his personal space, face flushed red, demanding Marcus fix the situation. Marcus turned around and jabbed a finger directly into my brother's chest. The cheap litigator had found his spine. He told Carter that he would not sacrifice his law license for a family of amateur felons. He stated loudly that they had handed him a forged document and lied to his face. He advised them to find a criminal defense attorney, step back into the elevator car, and let the doors slide shut. My family was left standing in the vast, empty courthouse corridor. They were legally stranded. Their bank accounts remained frozen. Their credit lines were dead. They possessed exactly zero liquidity to hire another lawyer. Furthermore, the local legal community is incredibly small. Word of Marcus Greer fleeing an ethical nightmare would circulate through every law office in Bismarck before the lunch hour ended. No respectable attorney would touch their case file without an enormous upfront retainer. And even then, defending documented forgery is a toxic endeavor. They were entirely isolated. I walked past them without turning my head. Calvin walked beside me. We exited the building and stepped into the biting North Dakota chill. I did not drive back to the high school. I had taken a personal day anticipating the implosion. I knew the adrenaline wearing off would leave my family raw, volatile, and desperate. I knew they would retreat to the only piece of property they mistakenly believed they still controlled. I drove my old sedan out toward the rural county highway, steering toward the Mitchell farm. I parked a quarter-mile down the dirt road, pulling off onto the frozen shoulder. The sweeping expanse of the prairie offered zero cover, but I did not need to hide. I turned off the engine and cracked the driver's side window. The winter wind howled across the flat landscape, carrying the scent of impending snow and dry earth. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the farmhouse driveway. Carter's leased European sports car and my parents' SUV were parked haphazardly near the front porch. The psychological pressure cooker detonated 20 minutes later. The front door of the farmhouse burst open. Carter stormed out onto the wooden porch, not bothering to zip his expensive winter coat. David followed him, reaching out a hand in a pathetic attempt to calm his son. Susan stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Even from a distance, the physical dynamic told the entire story. The fragile alliance binding the golden child to his enablers had shattered into jagged pieces. Carter spun around on the gravel driveway. The wind carried his shouting voice down the road, delivering the fragmented syllables right through my open window. He was screaming at his mother. He blamed Susan for executing a sloppy tracing. He blamed David for failing to control me. He was watching his $90,000 luxury truck slip away. He was watching his high-interest bridge loans convert into crushing immediate debt. He pointed frantically at the surrounding wheat fields, screaming that they had messed up his money. Narcissism dictates that the individual is never at fault. Carter had happily presented the forged amendment to the bank. He had gladly signed the fraudulent letter of intent with the energy executives. But now that the federal trap had snapped shut, he was rewriting history. He stepped closer to Susan, his posture menacing. I heard him deliver the ultimate threat. He told his own mother that he would not go to prison for her. He explicitly stated that if the prosecutor offered a plea deal, he would sit in the witness chair, swear on a Bible, and testify that Susan engineered the entire forgery behind his back. Susan visibly recoiled. The weapon she had spent 3 decades sharpening had just turned around and sliced her own throat. She had shielded Carter from every consequence of his adult life. She had sacrificed my grandfather's legacy, my inheritance, and her own husband's integrity, just to fund Carter's delusions of grandeur. Hearing him threaten to testify against her broke something fundamental inside her. She screamed back at him, her voice cracking under the frigid air, calling him an ungrateful coward. David stood between them on the frozen gravel. He looked small. He looked withered. He did not raise his voice to defend his wife. He did not scold his son. He just looked at the frozen dirt under his boots, realizing that his lifelong strategy of passive avoidance had finally led him into a nightmare he could not ignore. The family unit was dead. The foundation had crumbled, and the walls were caving in. I sat in my cold car and watched the spectacle. I did not intervene. I did not feel the urge to drive up the gravel path and gloat. Gloating is an emotional reaction, and I had drained the emotion from this equation days ago. I was simply observing the natural, inevitable consequences of their own blinding greed. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and I was watching the winter wind blow the entire structure into the frozen prairie dust. The destruction of their personal relationships was satisfying, but the financial trap had yet to reach its terrifying conclusion. Carter was still clinging to a desperate, fading hope that he could salvage his deal with the Texas energy conglomerate. He foolishly believed that corporate executives cared about family drama. He did not understand that multi-billion-dollar corporations employ armies of specialized title researchers. Those researchers were currently sitting in a Houston office building, reviewing the newly filed federal trust bearing my name and preparing to drop a corporate anvil directly onto Carter's head. Multi-billion-dollar energy corporations do not operate on emotion. They do not care about family loyalty, small-town gossip, or the inflated ego of a failed software entrepreneur. They function purely on risk assessment and clear, unencumbered legal title. When Carter Mitchell sat in that upscale hotel conference room and signed his name to the preliminary letter of intent, he assumed his signature was the final hurdle. He believed his superficial charm had secured a fortune. He did not understand the grueling, methodical vetting process that follows any corporate land acquisition. Down in Houston, a team of highly specialized title researchers opened the file on the Mitchell farm. These individuals spend their entire careers hunting for microscopic flaws in property deeds. They did not look at Carter's tailored suit. They did not listen to the rumors my mother had planted in the local diner. They looked strictly at the county registry. The researchers pulled the public records for the 2,000-acre estate. They found the amendment my parents had recently filed under oath. To an untrained eye, the paperwork looked standard, but right beneath it, resting in the digital database like a loaded snare, they found the cease and desist Calvin Reed had submitted. The corporate researchers pulled the corresponding files. They discovered the sealed federal trust. They read the sworn stamped signature of Judge Silas Thorne. In the realm of corporate law, a property dispute involving a sitting federal authority is a radioactive asset. The risk assessment team immediately flagged the Mitchell file. The legal department drafted a swift clinical response. They did not call my brother to break the news gently. They sent a certified termination letter. Calvin Reed received a courtesy copy of the correspondence to verify the action. The document was a masterpiece of legal severing. It informed Carter that his representations of ownership were fraudulent. The energy conglomerate formally withdrew their surface offer of $1.2 million. The letter stated in stark, unforgiving black and white text that Carter did not own the surface land. He did not own the mineral rights. He possessed zero legal standing to negotiate on behalf of the estate. The corporation dissolved the illusion of his wealth with a single postage stamp. But energy titans do not walk away from untapped crude oil. The Williston Basin is far too lucrative to abandon over a petty family squabble. The executives simply recalibrated their targeting system. They adjusted their focus from the loud, useless brother to the quiet, actual owner. They bypassed the amateur noise and contacted Calvin Reed. I was sitting in my apartment on Wednesday evening when the pivot occurred. The radiator clanked in the corner of my small living room, fighting against the freezing prairie night. A private courier knocked on my front door. He did not ask for a signature. He simply handed me a thick, rigid cardboard envelope bearing the return address of the Houston headquarters. I took the package to my small kitchen table. The overhead light cast a pale yellow glow across the worn Formica surface. I pulled the red nylon tab and slid the heavy proposal out of the cardboard sleeve. The document was dense with geological surveys, extraction parameters, and stringent liability clauses. I turned past the technical jargon, flipping straight to the financial summary on page 4. The number stared back at me in bold, unyielding ink. $8.5 million. This was not a projection based on future market trends. It was a formal, binding offer for the exclusive subsurface mineral rights of the Mitchell estate. The contract detailed a staggering upfront signing bonus, coupled with a generous permanent percentage of all future production royalties. The corporation wanted the crude oil trapped in the deep shale, and they were willing to pay an empire-making fortune to secure the drilling rights. I sat back in my wooden chair. The apartment was profoundly quiet. I looked at the crisp corporate letterhead, and then I looked at the math of my family's betrayal. Carter had traded his integrity, his parents' freedom, and my grandfather's legacy for a surface deal worth $1.2 million. He had manipulated our mother and terrified our father just to secure a fraction of the actual value. They had thrown me away for a cheap, imaginary payout. They were so consumed by the superficial dirt they could see with their own eyes that they entirely ignored the ocean of wealth buried in the stone beneath their feet. I reached across the table. Sitting next to my ceramic salt shaker was a small, silver-framed photograph. I took the picture 5 years ago during a brutal summer harvest. It did not show Grandpa Henry's face. It only showed his hands resting on the worn steering wheel of his combine harvester. The skin was weathered, deeply tanned, and stained with permanent traces of motor oil. The knuckles were swollen, twisted by the early stages of the arthritis that would eventually paralyze his grip. Those hands had worked the North Dakota topsoil for 4 decades. He had endured freezing winters, devastating droughts, and fluctuating wheat prices. He had lived the modest, grueling life of a prairie farmer, waking up before dawn and going to sleep with aching muscles. He lived that harsh reality, knowing all along that a multi-million-dollar fortune rested 2 miles straight down. He kept the secret. He endured the physical pain. He never sold the mineral rights to make his own life easier. He built an ironclad legal fortress around the oil because he knew exactly who my mother was. He knew Susan would only ever value the surface. He knew Carter would try to sell the land for a quick, flashy prize. Grandpa Henry held on to the secret so he could hand the true value of the earth to the one person who actually respected the dirt. I did not feel the urge to celebrate. I did not want to pop a bottle of champagne or call a friend to boast. I experienced a moment of profound, quiet vindication. It is the kind of peace that settles deep into your bones when the truth finally catches up to the lie. My grandfather had protected me from beyond the grave. He had armed me with a fortune profound enough to alter the trajectory of my entire life, and he had executed the plan while letting my greedy relatives construct their own airtight prison. I set the $8.5 million offer letter down, gently resting the edge of the thick paper against the silver frame of the photograph. The contrast between the sterile corporate contract and the image of those hard-working hands was striking. It represented the ultimate triumph of quiet endurance over loud entitlement. The corporate offer was secured, but the legal war was not yet finished. The formal probate hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. The county courthouse awaited us. Susan, David, and Carter were now legally stranded. Their discount attorney had fled. Their bank accounts remained frozen. They had just lost their fraudulent energy deal, stripping away their final delusion of wealth. They were backed into a terrifying, inescapable corner. A desperate animal is the most unpredictable kind of threat. My mother was a woman who refused to accept defeat, even when the walls were closing in around her. She was going to walk into that courthouse and attempt to salvage her shattered reality. She would have to stand before a judge without legal counsel, without evidence, and without the fortune she had sacrificed her own family to steal. The final execution of the trap was set. The stage was prepared. We were going to court. Friday morning broke over the North Dakota plains with a crisp, biting cold that made the dawn air taste like iron. The sky was a pale, bruised purple, devoid of any warmth or cloud cover. I woke up long before my alarm clock sounded. I lay in the quiet darkness of my apartment, listening to the steady hum of the heating vent, preparing my mind for the impending execution of the legal trap. Today was the day the fragile illusions constructed by my family would finally meet the unyielding reality of the judicial system. I stepped out of bed and walked to my small closet. As a high school earth science teacher, my standard wardrobe consisted of thick knit sweaters, comfortable slacks, and practical boots designed to survive long hours standing on linoleum floors. I bypassed those familiar garments. Today required a different kind of uniform. I pulled out a sharp, understated navy blue suit I had purchased years ago for academic conferences. The fabric was structured and severe. I paired it with a crisp white blouse and simple black heels. I pulled my hair back into a tight, neat knot at the base of my neck. I looked into the bathroom mirror and saw a woman stripped of any remaining sentimentality. I projected nothing but calm, relentless authority. I was ready. The drive into downtown Bismarck was swift and quiet. The frozen streets were mostly empty, offering zero distractions from the task ahead. I parked my old sedan a few blocks away from the county building, embracing the short walk through the frigid wind to clear my thoughts. The courthouse loomed at the end of the street. It was an imposing structure, built from heavy gray stone featuring tall, imposing columns and wide granite steps. It stood as a permanent physical reminder that the truth outlasts human deception. I climbed the stone steps and pulled open the heavy glass door. The interior of the building offered immediate refuge from the freezing wind, replacing the scent of frost with the distinct odor of floor wax and aged paper. I navigated the metal detectors and rode the slow, creaking elevator to the third floor, where the probate divisions were located. Calvin Reed was already waiting in the corridor outside courtroom 4. He wore a pristine charcoal gray suit and held a thick leather briefcase containing the meticulously organized instruments of our impending victory. He offered a brief, respectful nod as I approached. We did not exchange pleasantries. There was no need for small talk. The strategy was flawless, the evidence was insurmountable, and the outcome was practically guaranteed. We stood side by side in the quiet hallway, waiting for the opposition to arrive. They appeared 10 minutes later, stepping off the elevator at the far end of the long marble corridor. Susan David and Carter Mitchell walked toward us. The physical transformation they had undergone over the past 48 hours was startling. The polished, arrogant veneer they had maintained since Grandpa Henry passed away had evaporated entirely. They looked like survivors, stumbling away from a devastating wreckage. Susan usually spent hours crafting an immaculate appearance before stepping into any public space. Her hair was always perfectly styled, her makeup expertly applied to project maternal superiority. This morning, her hair hung flat and lifeless. Her tailored wool coat looked wrinkled, suggesting she had slept in it or had not bothered to hang it up. Dark exhaustion circles shadowed her eyes, betraying sleepless nights spent screaming at her husband and son. David shuffled beside her, staring fixedly at the scuffed marble floor. He looked hollowed out, reduced to a fragile shell of a man. His shoulders stooped under the invisible, crushing weight of his own cowardly choices. He held a thin, disorganized stack of papers in his trembling hands. Carter walked a few steps ahead of his parents, attempting to project his usual swagger, but failing miserably. His expensive designer suit, the one he had purchased on credit to celebrate his fraudulent corporate conquest, was noticeably rumpled. He carried a cheap manila folder tucked under his arm. The visual contrast between their chaotic desperation and our quiet preparation was stark. They were arriving to defend a fabricated legal document against a federal affidavit without professional representation. Every single law firm in the county had rejected their desperate pleas for counsel after Marcus Greer fled the case. The local attorneys knew the file was toxic. They refused to touch a dispute involving undeniable forgery and the wrath of Judge Silas Thorne. Left with zero alternatives, my family was forced to appear pro se, representing themselves in a complex fraud hearing. Navigating a courtroom without a lawyer is a dangerous gamble, even for a minor traffic violation. Attempting to defend a felony perjury charge against a seasoned litigator like Calvin Reed was equivalent to walking into a blazing inferno wearing a suit made of dry paper. The hallway was long, forcing them to endure a slow, agonizing approach toward the courtroom doors. The spatial dynamics amplified the tension. The rhythmic echoing of their footsteps bounced off the high plaster ceilings, sounding like a slow, unyielding drumbeat. They stopped 10 feet away from us. The suffocating tension filled the narrow corridor, pressing against my chest. Susan opened her mouth. Her jaw trembled slightly. I watched her struggle to find the right words to hurl in my direction. She wanted to unleash another barrage of vicious threats. She wanted to blame me for her ruined reputation and her frozen bank accounts. But the words died in her throat. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of the courthouse environment silenced her. She realized that any outburst in this hallway would only further demonstrate her instability to the armed bailiffs standing nearby. She snapped her mouth shut and glared at me with raw, unfiltered hatred. David refused to lift his gaze. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, inspecting the intricate patterns in the marble tiles, preferring the cold stone to the reality of his daughter standing before him. Carter scoffed, attempting to break the heavy silence. He shifted his cheap manila folder from his right arm to his left, bringing his wrist up toward his chest. That small movement caught my attention. The cuff of his expensive dress shirt pulled back, revealing a thick gold chain wrapped around his wrist. My eyes locked onto the object. It was a vintage brass pocket watch, converted into a clumsy wristwatch using a custom leather band. The glass face was slightly scratched, carrying the distinct patina of decades spent in harsh environments. It was Grandpa Henry's retirement gift from the Regional Agricultural Board. My grandfather had cherished that timepiece. He kept it polished and pristine, carrying it in his overalls every single day for 30 years. He used it to time his harvest schedules, to track the incoming storm fronts, and to measure the long, grueling hours under the prairie sun. The internal gears possessed a very specific, heavy, rhythmic ticking sound. Carter had looted the watch from the farmhouse bedroom. He had taken an object of immense sentimental value and repurposed it into a tacky fashion accessory to complement his designer suit. He wore the stolen heirloom with the casual indifference of a man who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. The corridor was so profoundly quiet that I could actually hear the watch ticking. Tick, tick, tick. The sound reverberated in the cold hallway. It was a relentless mechanical heartbeat. Carter stood there, smirking slightly, believing the stolen gold on his wrist made him look powerful. He did not realize the deep poetic irony of the moment. He was wearing stolen time. Every single tick of those internal brass gears was counting down the final remaining seconds of his unearned arrogance. He expected me to react. He wanted me to point at the watch, to demand it back, to lose my composure over the stolen artifact. He was desperate for any interaction that would lower me to his chaotic level. I stared at the antique timepiece for a long moment, honoring the memory of the man who had truly earned it. Then I raised my eyes and looked directly into Carter's face. I offered him nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no vindication. I gave him the exact same cold, empty silence he had given me for my entire life. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4 suddenly swung open. The uniformed bailiff stepped into the threshold holding a clipboard. He called the docket number for the Mitchell estate hearing, projecting his voice down the corridor. The moment of waiting was over. The time for passive observation had expired. I turned away from my family, severing the suffocating tension in the hallway. I did not look back to see if they were following. I stepped forward, my heels clicking firmly against the polished marble floor. Calvin Reed walked beside me, holding the truth in his leather briefcase. I crossed the threshold, passing through the double wooden doors, entering the arena where their fabricated reality would be systematically dismantled. The audience was primed, the evidence was undeniable, and the execution of the trap was about to commence. The interior of courtroom 4 was suffocatingly quiet. The air smelled of aged oak panels and floor wax. Rows of empty wooden pews stretched behind us, offering zero audience for the impending destruction. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the morning frost, trapping the tension inside the high-ceilinged chamber. I sat next to Calvin Reed at the petitioner table. My posture remained rigid, my hands folded, resting on top of a blank legal pad. A few feet away at the respondent table, Susan, David, and Carter sat in a disorganized cluster. They had no legal counsel to guide them. They had no polished strategy. They were 3 desperate civilians attempting to navigate a labyrinth designed to crush liars. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff instructed everyone to rise. Judge Arthur Thomas entered the room. He was a veteran jurist with silver hair and a reputation for possessing zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. He took his seat, adjusted his dark robes, and opened the thick file resting on his desk. He looked over his reading glasses, surveying the 2 tables. He noted the absence of Marcus Greer. He addressed my parents directly, confirming they were proceeding without professional representation. Susan nodded, her voice barely a whisper. The judge warned them that the rules of evidence apply equally to everyone, regardless of their legal training. The floor belonged to Calvin Reed. My attorney stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not pound his fist on the table. He spoke with the measured, lethal cadence of a surgeon explaining a fatal diagnosis. Your Honor, Calvin began placing a single sheet of paper onto the overhead projector. We are here today because the respondents submitted a fraudulent document to this court under penalty of perjury. They claim Henry Mitchell executed an amendment transferring his entire estate to his grandson. That claim is a fabrication. Susan gripped the edge of her table. She tried to interrupt, claiming the document was authentic. Judge Thomas struck his wooden gavel once. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He stared at my mother, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You will speak only when instructed to speak," the judge warned. "Another outburst will result in a contempt charge." "Continue, Mr. Reed." Calvin introduced our first piece of evidence. He presented a sworn report from an independent forensic document examiner who had spent 30 years working for the State Bureau of Investigation. The examiner had analyzed the physical ink submitted by my parents. Calvin pointed to the projected image of the signature on the wall. He detailed the forensic findings. The ink distribution was entirely uniform, lacking the natural variation in pressure created by human movement. There were microscopic hesitation marks at the top of the capital letters. The ink pooled unnaturally at the bottom of the loops. These were the undeniable physical artifacts of a slow, deliberate tracing process. Furthermore, the report confirmed that the mechanical flow of the pen was a physical impossibility for a man suffering from severe, documented rheumatoid arthritis. David closed his eyes and lowered his head. He looked like a man waiting for a firing squad. Calvin did not pause to let them breathe. He reached into his briefcase and produced the heavy parchment bearing the gold-embossed seal of the United States District Court. "Exhibit B," Calvin announced, "the sworn affidavit of Senior Federal Judge Silas Thorne." Judge Thomas leaned forward, his eyebrows raising a fraction of an inch. A local county magistrate holds deep, intrinsic respect for the federal bench. He accepted the document from the bailiff. The courtroom fell so silent, I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. We waited while Judge Thomas read the affidavit. The seconds stretched into agonizing minutes for my family. The judge read how Silas Thorne had personally witnessed Henry Mitchell execute an ironclad federal trust 14 months prior. He read how Silas verified my grandfather's mental acuity. And finally, he read the devastating sentence where a sitting federal authority declared the signature submitted by my parents was a clumsy tracing that insulted the legacy of a hard-working man. Judge Thomas lowered the paper. He looked at Susan and David. His expression contained no anger. It only held the terrifying, cold weight of judicial certainty. Calvin delivered the final structural blow. He submitted the true federal trust into evidence, officially establishing me as the sole irrevocable trustee of the entire 2,000-acre estate and all associated mineral rights. The document superseded everything. It rendered their forged amendment entirely worthless. Judge Thomas removed his reading glasses. He folded his hands together on the bench. His voice was like cracking ice. "The judicial system functions on a very fragile premise," the judge said, directing his words entirely at the respondent table. "We rely on the sanctity of the oath. When you stand in the clerk's office, raise your right hand and swear that a document is genuine, you are entering into a binding covenant with the law." Susan began to weep. It was not her usual performative, graceful crying. It was a chaotic, hyperventilating panic. Submitting a fabricated will to steal an inheritance is not a family misunderstanding. The judge continued, his tone dropping an octave. "It is an assault on the integrity of this court. I am striking this fraudulent amendment from the record permanently. Furthermore, I am legally obligated by the statutes of this state to forward all transcripts, exhibits, and evidence from today's hearing directly to the district attorney. I am making a formal referral for criminal indictment on the charges of felony fraud and perjury." The reality of the referral hit David like a physical strike. He slumped forward in his wooden chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. A criminal referral from a sitting judge meant the prosecutor would not even have to investigate. The case was already gift-wrapped. They were going to face grand jury indictments before the end of the month. Then the true nature of my brother revealed itself. Carter realized the ship was sinking into the abyss. His narcissism kicked into high gear, desperate to find a lifeboat. He stood up abruptly, knocking his wooden chair backward. The chair clattered loudly against the floor. "Your Honor," Carter shouted, pointing a trembling finger directly at his own mother. "I did not do this. I had nothing to do with the paperwork. She is the one who filed it. She handed it to me and told me Grandpa changed his mind. I am just the beneficiary. I am a victim here, too." Susan stopped crying instantly. She turned and stared at her golden child. The profound horror registering on her face was exquisite. She had sacrificed her integrity, her husband, and her daughter to fund this man's delusions. Now, facing the terrifying prospect of a prison cell, her precious son was offering her up to the slaughter just to save his own skin. Calvin Reid did not sit down. He remained standing at the podium. He waited for Carter to finish his desperate plea for amnesty. "Your Honor," Calvin said, his voice slicing through the frantic noise. "If it pleases the court, I have one final exhibit to submit regarding Mr. Carter Mitchell's claim of ignorance." Calvin opened a separate thin blue folder. He pulled out a stack of printed emails and digital receipts. "During the discovery phase, we subpoenaed the electronic footprint surrounding the creation of the forged document," Calvin explained. "My client recalled signing a Mother's Day card featuring the exact unique flourish found on the forged witness line. We traced the digital origin of the fabricated amendment." Calvin handed the printed emails to the bailiff. 3 days after Henry Mitchell passed away, Calvin continued. Carter Mitchell utilized his personal laptop to access an offshore freelance graphic design website. He uploaded a high-resolution scan of the Mother's Day card. He then explicitly directed a freelance digital artist to isolate the signatures of Henry Mitchell and Elise Mitchell, convert them into vector files, and overlay them onto a generic legal waiver template. Carter froze. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale yellow. The digital receipts confirm that Carter Mitchell paid $400 for this illicit service, Calvin stated, driving the final nail into the coffin. The transaction was processed using a credit card registered in his name. The IP address matches his downtown loft. He did not just benefit from the forgery. He commissioned it. He paid for it. He orchestrated the entire crime. The silence that followed was absolute. The mechanical ticking of the stolen antique pocket watch on Carter's wrist seemed to echo throughout the entire room. Carter stood frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open, staring at the printed emails resting on the judge's bench. His desperate attempt to throw his mother under the bus had collided with an impenetrable wall of digital forensic evidence. He was trapped. He was exposed as the architect of his own destruction. The trap snapped shut perfectly. There were no more lies to spin. There were no more corners to hide in. The math of their betrayal was finalized, and the bill was officially due. The echo of a wooden gavel striking a mahogany block possesses a unique, irreversible finality. When Judge Thomas finalized the order, the manufactured reality my family had fought so desperately to protect shattered into microscopic fragments. The court clerk stamped the official decree, legally validating the federal trust. In the span of a single morning, the sprawling 2,000-acre property, the weathered farmhouse, and the staggering $8.5 million subsurface mineral lease were formally transferred into my sole possession. I walked out of the county courthouse, leaving Susan, David, and Carter standing in the quiet gallery. They were entirely stripped of their leverage, their dignity, and their stolen fortune. The ensuing aftermath did not unfold over months or years. It descended upon them with the swift, unforgiving velocity of a prairie blizzard. Carter was the first to experience the brutal mechanics of financial ruin. The high-interest bridge loans he had secured using the forged amendment required immediate servicing. When the bank froze the estate accounts and the Houston Energy executives terminated his fraudulent contract, his credit line evaporated. Corporate lenders do not offer grace periods to individuals involved in felony perjury investigations. They dispatch recovery agents. The spectacle occurred the very next afternoon, right in the center of downtown Bismarck. Carter was sitting inside a trendy corner cafe nursing an overpriced espresso, desperately trying to project an aura of unbothered success to anyone watching. He had parked his pristine $90,000 luxury truck directly in front of the large glass windows. A heavy-duty diesel tow truck idled down the street, its amber lights flashing against the gray winter sky. The driver did not possess the subtle, apologetic demeanor of a parking enforcement officer. He was a seasoned repossession agent holding a federal lien. He backed the rusted flatbed directly toward Carter's gleaming black bumper. The mechanical whine of the hydraulic lift pierced the quiet afternoon air. Carter jumped up from his cafe table, knocking his ceramic mug onto the floor, and bolted out the front door. He shouted at the driver, demanding he lower the vehicle, frantically waving his arms and pointing at his tailored suit as if his wardrobe somehow granted him legal immunity. The repo agent did not stop the winch. He calmly stepped out of his cab, handed my brother a printed notice of default, and returned to his controls. The heavy steel cables pulled the pristine truck onto the slanted flatbed. The tires screeched against the metal grating. Dozens of pedestrians stopped on the frozen sidewalks to watch the golden child lose his prized possession. Carter stood in the ankle-deep slush, wearing his expensive leather shoes, holding a piece of paper that confirmed his absolute insolvency. The antique pocket watch ticked on his wrist, but the time for arrogance had officially expired. While Carter suffered his public humiliation, my parents faced a much darker, far more terrifying reckoning. A criminal referral from a sitting judge bypasses the usual bureaucratic delays. The district attorney reviewed the transcripts, the forensic handwriting analysis, and the sworn affidavit from Judge Silas Thorne. The prosecutor did not hesitate. The office convened a grand jury, and the indictments for felony fraud and perjury were handed down swiftly. Facing state felony charges requires a caliber of legal defense that operates on an entirely different financial stratosphere than a discount strip mall attorney. Susan and David needed a seasoned criminal litigator to keep them out of a state penitentiary. Premium defense lawyers demand exorbitant retainers paid upfront in certified funds. My parents' checking accounts were frozen. Their credit cards were maxed out from years of projecting false wealth. They possessed only one remaining tangible asset. 2 weeks after the courthouse hearing, a wooden post was hammered into the manicured front lawn of the suburban house where I grew up. A bright red real estate sign swung in the biting wind. The home my mother had spent 3 decades decorating the pristine sanctuary she used to host elegant dinner parties and project maternal superiority was listed for sale at a desperate below-market price. They were forced to liquidate their entire life just to afford a lawyer who might negotiate a plea deal. I drove past the neighborhood once on my way to the hardware store. I saw David carrying cardboard moving boxes out to a rented utility van. His shoulders were hunched, his movements slow and defeated. He was packing up the remnants of a marriage built on cowardice and greed, preparing to downsize into a cramped rental apartment while awaiting trial. The financial devastation was agonizing, but the social exile was the true fatal blow for Susan. My mother drew her oxygen from the admiration of her peers. She thrived on the respect of the local choir, the deference of the grocery store clerks, and the envy of her neighbors. She had weaponized that exact social ecosystem against me, spreading vicious lies to paint me as a greedy, ungrateful daughter. Small towns possess long, unforgiving memories. When the local newspaper published a brief, factual article detailing the grand jury indictments and the forged probate documents, the truth swept through the community like a wildfire. The very same people who had given me cold shoulders in the diner suddenly realized they had been manipulated by a sociopath. Susan experienced the crushing weight of total excommunication. When she walked into the local pharmacy to collect a prescription, the conversational hum died instantly. The women she had successfully turned against me now looked right through her, offering nothing but hostile, icy silence. The church choir politely informed her that her continued presence was a distraction to the congregation. She was uninvited from neighborhood gatherings. She became a ghost in her own town, haunted by the undeniable public proof of her own deceit. The social throne she had spent a lifetime building was dismantled overnight. Throughout their rapid, spectacular collapse, I maintained absolute distance. I did not send a single text message. I did not drive to Carter's apartment to gloat over his repossessed truck. I did not call my father to offer hollow sympathy. Vengeance executed through screaming matches or vindictive text messages is a fragile, exhausting endeavor. True victory resides in silence. I simply existed in my peaceful reality, sitting at my kitchen table, drinking warm tea, while grading earth science exams. I watched the inevitable consequences of their own actions crush them under a spectacular gravitational weight. The transition of the estate was seamless. Calvin Reed facilitated the legal transfer with quiet efficiency. I signed the official contract with the Houston Energy conglomerate, authorizing the extraction of the deep shale crude oil. The upfront signing bonus alone was enough to alter the trajectory of my entire existence, securing a level of financial independence that my brother had desperately tried to steal. Yet as the zeros multiplied in the newly established trust accounts, I found my thoughts drifting away from the corporate contracts. I did not care about luxury vehicles or sprawling suburban mansions. My mind returned consistently to the frozen, sweeping expanse of the prairie. I thought about the 2,000 acres of topsoil resting above the shale. I thought about the weathered farmhouse standing empty in the wind, holding the quiet echoes of a man who understood the enduring value of the earth. The antagonists had been removed from the board, the legal war was won, and the fortune was secured. Now the final task remained. It was time to return to the dirt and restore the legacy they had tried so hard to pave over. Spring arrives late in the Williston Basin. The deep winter freeze does not surrender easily. The ice retreats inch by inch, giving way to thick, dark mud and the faint green promise of new crops. The shifting of the season mirrored the transition of my own life. The sterile, fluorescent glow of the county courthouse was behind me. The frantic, desperate noise of my family had faded into a distant echo. Susan, David, and Carter were currently navigating the crushing reality of pretrial hearings and asset liquidation. They lived in a cramped rental apartment on the edge of town, learning how to survive without the counterfeit wealth they had chased for decades. I remained in my quiet reality, focusing my attention back on the soil. The Houston Energy executives returned to North Dakota in early April. They rented the exact same upscale hotel conference room where Carter had signed his disastrous, fraudulent paperwork. They expected to conclude our business quickly. They assumed that offering a rural high school teacher a check for $8.5 million would guarantee a rapid, unquestioning signature. They underestimated the legacy of Henry Mitchell. I did not walk into that hotel wearing a tailored suit. I wore a simple knit sweater and carried a heavy canvas tote bag. I sat across the polished mahogany table from 3 corporate lawyers and the lead acquisition scout. They slid the finalized lease agreement toward me, offering a complimentary gold pen. I did not pick up the pen. I opened my canvas bag and pulled out a thick binder filled with topographical maps, aquifer schematics, and sedimentary soil reports. I am an earth science teacher, I told them, keeping my voice level and calm. I understand the mechanics of hydraulic fracturing. I know the exact value of the crude oil trapped in the deep shale beneath my property. I also know the fragile nature of the topsoil resting above it. The executives exchanged confused, hesitant glances. I opened my binder and presented my mandatory addendums. I used the immense leverage of their own geological surveys against them. I demanded strict, uncompromising environmental protections written directly into the binding contract. I required closed-loop water recycling systems to protect the local aquifers from chemical runoff. I mandated comprehensive topsoil restoration protocols for every single square foot of surface land disturbed by the drilling pads. I demanded independent environmental oversight funded entirely by their corporate budget. The lead executive attempted to negotiate, citing standard industry practices and profit margins. I closed my binder and looked him directly in the eyes. I informed him that standard practices were insufficient for this specific acreage. I reminded him that they were not purchasing the land. They were only leasing the deep stone. The surface dirt belonged to me, and I would not allow a single drop of toxic runoff to poison the fields my grandfather had cultivated for 40 years. I gave them a simple choice: sign the environmental addendums, or I would walk away and leave the oil buried in the dark forever. They looked at the geological data. They looked at the projected profit margins. They signed my addendums. The funds cleared my trust account 3 days later. The string of zeros on the digital bank statement was incomprehensible. It was a magnitude of wealth that ruins weak people. It fuels arrogance. It breeds the exact kind of suffocating greed that had hollowed out my parents and destroyed my brother. I recognized the danger of that money. I knew the only way to neutralize the poison was to give the power back to the prairie. I hired Calvin Reed to draft the foundational paperwork for a new charitable trust. We established the Henry Mitchell Agricultural Grant. The initiative was designed with a very specific, uncompromising mission. We did not fund corporate farming conglomerates. We targeted the actual heartbeat of the North Dakota agricultural community. We sought out young, independent farmers who possessed calloused hands and mounting debts. Within the first month, the foundation paid off a crippling equipment loan for a 24-year-old woman struggling to keep her family's soybean operation afloat. We purchased a new tractor transmission for a young couple who had lost their primary vehicle during a brutal winter storm. We provided the financial oxygen that banks routinely denied. We erased predatory debt for the people who actually woke up before dawn to feed the country. I funneled the vast majority of the oil royalties directly into this grant, ensuring that my grandfather's hidden fortune would permanently sustain the community he loved. I kept my teaching salary. I kept my modest apartment. I kept my old sedan. I did not need anything else. On a quiet Saturday morning in late May, I drove out to the farm. The snow had vanished entirely, replaced by the vibrant, sprawling green of early wheat. The dirt road was dry, kicking up a familiar trail of pale dust behind my tires. I parked near the old wooden barn. The property was silent, save for the rhythmic calls of the meadowlarks swooping over the fields. The Houston Energy Company was already setting up their initial drilling equipment on the far southwestern corner of the acreage, utilizing the designated access roads I had mandated. The rest of the farm remained untouched. I walked toward the barn, pulling open the heavy, sliding wooden door. The hinges creaked loudly, breaking the morning silence. The interior smelled of aged cedar, dried hay, and faint traces of motor oil. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight piercing through the gaps in the wooden slat walls. This was Grandpa Henry's true sanctuary. It was the place where he repaired broken machinery, sharpened his tools, and found quiet refuge from the relentless demands of the harvest. I walked over to his long wooden workbench. The surface was scarred and stained, bearing the physical memories of 1,000 repairs. A row of heavy iron wrenches hung neatly on a pegboard. Small glass jars filled with assorted nails and screws lined the upper shelf. Everything remained exactly where he had left it. I pulled open the wide bottom drawer of the bench. Resting inside, beneath a coiled length of thick nylon rope, was a pair of heavy leather work gloves. I reached down and picked them up. The leather was stiff, deeply stained with dark grease and prairie dirt. But the most striking feature was the shape. The gloves were permanently curved. The thick leather fingers hooked inward, holding the exact shape of a man gripping a heavy steering wheel. Decades of sweat, immense physical labor, and gripping cold had molded the material into a permanent cast of my grandfather's arthritic hands. Even in rest, the gloves maintained the posture of hard work. They held the invisible echo of his endurance. I stood in the quiet barn holding the stiff leather in my palms. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over my chest. I finally understood the core lesson he had spent his life trying to teach me. Value is not defined by the clothes you wear, the vehicle you drive, or the superficial lies you tell your neighbors. Value is defined by what you are willing to endure. Susan, David, and Carter had sprinted toward a mirage. They chased the illusion of wealth until it led them straight off a cliff. My grandfather had endured the harsh reality of the frozen earth, knowing the true treasure was hidden deep below the surface, waiting for the right person to unearth it. I brought the leather gloves back to my high school classroom. I placed them on the corner of my wooden desk, resting them right next to my favorite samples of quartz and sedimentary rock. My freshman students often ask me why I keep an old, dirty pair of work gloves sitting in a science lab. I tell them the gloves belong to the smartest geologist I ever met. I tell them the gloves are a reminder that the earth will always provide for those who respect the dirt, and it will always swallow those who try to pave over the truth. Have you ever found yourself trapped in a room with people who lie to your face? Have you ever felt the terrifying urge to scream, to defend yourself, to fight back against a towering wall of deception, only to realize that silence is a much sharper weapon? Have you ever had to stand perfectly still, enduring the cold judgment of others, simply waiting for the truth to do all the fighting for you? If you know what it feels like to watch a liar build their own trap, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below, tell me your name, and tell me how you survived the silence. Thank you for walking through the freezing prairie with me. Thank you for listening to the story of the Mitchell estate. If you want to hear another story about hidden inheritance, family betrayal, and the people who discover that the loudest voices in the room usually have the weakest foundations, the next video is waiting for you right now. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to QT Told Stories. I will see you in the next one.